the midst of everything that's exciting going on, we have to come back down to earth and open some books and study, which is what we're going to do tonight. Makes it a little difficult sometimes with foreign visitors visiting you and a little bit of everything happening. I think it's been 2 or 3 weeks since we've been on the Apocrypha, so again we had some unbeknownst to us time for all of us to obtain some copies. How many of you have a copy of the Apocrypha now? Well, that's a good number of you. Praise the Lord. It'll help as soon as you can get it, because as we did with First Esdras, we'll be doing tonight, we're going to be looking a lot at the material contained in the Apocrypha. It's a little bit difficult. We're trying to teach about the Apocrypha, trying to teach the book without teaching too much about the contents of the book. That's what a book is about, its content. So it makes it a little difficult because there's so much going on in some of these apocryphal books, most notably the one we'll start looking at tonight and the one we'll be to next week, that it'd be easy to slip right over into doing a historical study of the material there. But remember that we're studying the Apocrypha as such, and the apocryphal books, and not necessarily all of the content that we find in them. Now let me give you a few summary remarks concerning First Esdras, just to make sure that that's kind of summed up in your mind, because it was 2 or 3 weeks ago whenever we looked at that, and a lot of you didn't have your own private copies of the Apocrypha then. If you get a copy of the Apocrypha in another Bible, like I've got here with the NEB, then you can just bring that Bible on nights like this, and if you don't watch out, you begin thinking of this as a bad book or something because it's got the Apocrypha in it. So you think, I better bring my Bible along with it. Well, this is a Bible, just got the Apocrypha in it. So a couple of summary remarks about First Esdras. We said that it was noted in the first place as being the book most closely linked to the text of Scripture. That's because a large part of it is made up of 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So that saved us a lot of time of going throughout each chapter of the book of First Esdras, because to do that would be to look at Nehemiah, Ezra, and 2 Chronicles. Remember, I think everything except one verse in chapter 4 of Ezra is contained there in First Esdras, as well as some of Nehemiah 8 and 2 Chronicles 35 and 36. So of all of the books of the Apocrypha, it's the one that's most closely linked to the text of Scripture, because it, for the most part, just reproduces a lot of the text of the Old Testament. Which I guess in one sense of the word you could say it's the safest book, because for the most part, when you're reading it, you're reading Scripture. Then in the second place, these are really the two chief things to remember about First Esdras. The second place, the most important part for our studies of the Apocrypha of the book of First Esdras would be the tale of the three guardsmen. Remember where they're discussing what's the strongest thing? Wine, kings, women, truth. What's the strongest thing in the world? So that's a major part of the book. It's really the only original part of the book, and for us it's the most important part. We wouldn't need the repetition of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. We already have that. But that tale of the three guardsmen is very interesting. We spent a lot of time reading that. If you've got the Apocrypha, you can go back over it and you'll see what a beautiful Persian tale it is, and that's exactly what it is. It's an ancient Persian tale that's just been revised by some devious writer. So where does that bring us tonight then? Maccabees. We're going to start looking at the books of Maccabees. Now we'll probably just take a glance at all 4 or 5 of them, depending on how you want to count them. But of course we'll major on the first 2. First and Second Maccabees. Maccabees. It's easy to spell as long as you don't double the wrong letters. First Maccabees. First Esdras was the book most closely linked to the text of Scripture, First Maccabees is the most important of all of the apocryphal books and the most reliable one. Now obviously where First Esdras overlaps Scripture, assuming that there aren't mistakes, and there are mistakes between First Esdras and canonical Ezra, Nehemiah, 2nd Chronicles, assuming that that we do have mistakes there, which really we do, then First Maccabees puts itself far ahead as far as historical importance, the book of First Esdras. And even if First Esdras didn't have the mistakes, still you've got that whole middle section of the tale of the three guardsmen, which we know is just an ancient Persian tale that's been revised by this Jewish writer. So Maccabees, a lot of these books are just really out and out terrible, like 2nd Maccabees, whenever we get to it. But I don't want to put an unnecessary bad taste in your mouth about the whole Apocrypha when it's not necessary. First Maccabees is very important. First Maccabees is the most important. First Maccabees is just about the only source material that we have to reconstruct what's known as the Maccabean, or more technically the Hasmonean period. It's really the only book, the chief source that we have. Now, 2nd Maccabees does duplicate a little bit of 1st Maccabees. It parallels, let's say, chapters 3 to 7 of 1st Maccabees. But since it's got, about 16 or so chapters, or 15 chapters, it really adds in a few more details that 1st Maccabees doesn't. And in the writings of Josephus, we have a little more information about the Maccabean period. But all in all, the bottom line is 1st Maccabees is our most important source book for gleaning some information about these very, very important years in Israel between the end of the Old Testament period and the beginning of the New. So, first and foremost, it's a book of history. A lot of these other books are religious books. They're trying to get across some little religious idea to us. So Maccabees is not trying to present itself to be something that it's not. As we'll see in the case of books like Bell and Dragon, Susanna, Judith, Tobit, and so forth. These are fanciful religious books that are trying to inculcate religious ideas. And this is really not true. We see that the writer of First Maccabees most definitely was a pious individual. But more than being pious, he's nationalistic in his mind. He's a Jew through and through. And not a superstitious Jew to the extent that these other authors were, trying to add in a little extra canonical revelation about God, angels, and a lot of other things, a lot of other supernatural things that they try to add in. Most of the others are religious in nature as opposed to historical. Now, 2nd Maccabees, if you've read ahead, 2nd Maccabees is filled with history, but it's filled with religion at the same time, that you just really don't find in 1st Maccabees. And so you ought to, just in reading the book, if you know how to read ancient history, you can kind of detect whether or not someone's got a bone to pick about something, someone's trying to put across a new, neat little religious idea to us, or whether someone is really trying to give us the somber facts of history, which evidently is what the author of 1st Maccabees is doing. Which makes it a reliable book, just like you'd pick up some biography about George Washington. You wouldn't look at that and think, all right, this is a false book, this is a false book. So don't think that just because it's in the Apocrypha. Now, it does have a few historical, chronological, anachronistic mistakes in it, but so do all other books that aren't inspired of God. They all have mistakes in them. So that's no big deal. And we'll look at Maccabees more in detail later on. We're just going to kind of go through it this evening. But the material that it provides is really unique to the book. It's too bad that we don't have it in some other places, but we just don't. So let's say something about the authorship of the book to begin with. Now, the book is just filled with detailed descriptions of battles in Israel. The vast majority, just about all of the battles, are fought on Palestinian soil. And in relating to us all of these battles, the author manifests such an intimate knowledge of the geography of Palestine that it only makes sense that our guess should be that the author was a native Jew. Now you're going to contrast this, let's say, with our guess concerning the author of 2 Maccabees, which we'll tell you whenever we get there. But because he knows the land, in other words, of Israel so well, because he knows the land so well, it appears as though he's a native Jew. He lives in Palestine, doesn't live in Rome or Greece or Babylon or somewhere else. So it's written by a Jew. It covers the period from, let's say, the middle of the 2nd century BC down to, well, towards the end of the 2nd century, which means that it couldn't be written before the end date of 135 BC. So a guess for the date, and these are just guesses, would be around 100 BC for the author sitting down and penning the book of Maccabees. The events have to have already transpired before he can sit down and write them. Originally, the book was written in Hebrew. Jerome knew of the Hebrew manuscripts that contain the book of 1 Maccabees. But today, for the most part, we're dependent upon Greek translations, which show their Hebrew origin. Another thing about the author, which kind of shows him to be a typical Jew, and not only a typical Jew, but a native one. By that we mean someone who lives in Israel, not outside of Palestine, is the fact that he has a superstitious reverence for the name of God. He's very, very afraid to mention God's name due to the old Jewish superstition that had arisen that one might accidentally disobey Exodus 20, one of the commandments there of Moses, and use the name of the Lord in vain. So how do you miss doing that? Just don't use his name at all. Then you'll make sure that you never use it in vain. So if you've got the book, if you'll open to chapter 2, we'll start with verse 21. I'm just going to I've just picked out a few of the references that are very unique, very interesting to 1 Maccabees, are found to a lesser degree in 2 Maccabees. As we'll see whenever we get over there, we discuss the authorship, the questions of Pharisaic and Sadduceic origin for the authorship of 1 and 2 Maccabees. But here in 1 Maccabees, it's very, very obvious. In 1 Maccabees 2, in verse 21, now we're going to have to look at a lot of verses to establish the point, but if you've read it, it should have stood out to you. Well, just think back, if you have read the book 1 Maccabees, you didn't see the name of God in there. Never talks about God, never talks about the Lord. Now you open 2 Maccabees and you'll find God's name. Matter of fact, turn over to 2 Maccabees. Let's see if it doesn't start off somewhere in the first chapter. I mean, it's got to, because it's talking a lot. Well, there it is right in the 2nd verse, because here we're going to start off with a couple of letters from the Jews in Israel to the Jews in Egypt. He says right there in the 2nd verse, may God, G-O-D. You'll probably find, well, there down in verse 8, you see Lord. So you've got a different name. Verse 11, God. Verse 12, God. Verse 17, and so forth. Anyway, you find the name of God. And since you read your Bible so much, you're always saying God's name, you just pick up a book like 1 Maccabees. It ought to be kind of outstanding that never is the name of God mentioned in there. But look in verse 21. Here's what he substitutes. And we've even picked up this little phrase. I say we, people today. Heaven forbid that we should ever abandon the law and its statutes. Well, if you're swearing by heaven, then whose dwelling place is that? God. What you're trying to say is God forbid. that we should ever abandon the law and its statutes. Now, Paul over in the New Testament uses that little phrase, God forbid. Doesn't ever use the phrase, heaven forbid. Why? That was a superstitious phrase that the Jews used so that they could supplant the name of God with that of heaven. And you hear people down to this day speak of heaven forbid. Why not just say God forbid? They don't know that's a carryover from 1 Maccabees, all the way down to the days in which we live. Then in verse 61. Now you'll see it more clearly. You say, well, how do you know that he means God? Well, you don't know just from this verse. He could just say heaven forbid. But you'll see it as we build upon these verses. Down in verse 61, as generation succeeds generation, follow their example. Now, Mattathias has just given us a list of famous Old Testament Jews, which is a famous part here of 1 Maccabees. So he says, as generation succeeds generation, follow their example. For no one who trusts in heaven shall ever lack strength. Why not just say trust in God or trust in the Lord? Again, you could say, well, he could mean heaven as the abode of God. That's true. In chapter 3, verses 18 to 22. And here we've got the introduction of Judas. And he's giving a little speech concerning these overwhelming odds that have approached him. 1 Maccabees 3, verse 18. Judas replied, many can easily be overpowered by a few. By the way, he takes this phrase right out of the Old Testament. It makes no difference to heaven to save by many or by few. Now right away, that should have been God in there. It makes no difference to God, to the Lord, to save by many or by few. Victory does not depend on numbers. Strength comes from heaven alone. There's heaven again. Our enemies come filled with insolence and lawlessness to plunder and to kill us. So forth, heaven will crush them before our eyes. Ye need not be afraid of them. Then down in verse 50, says that they cried to heaven concerning their Nazarites. And over in chapter 4, verse 10, let us now cry to heaven to favor our cause. Verse 24. Now here in verse 24, it's really conclusive. That you know that what the author is talking about is not just the abode of God. He means God. You see, you could use the word heaven and really mean heaven, but he doesn't mean heaven. He substitutes the place where God lives for the name of God himself. Because look at what it says. You're going to have a masculine pronoun, possessive pronoun afterwards. And heaven's not masculine. On their return, 1 Maccabees 4:24. On their return, they sang songs of thanksgiving and praised heaven. For it is right, because his mercy endures forever. So they're praising heaven. You see, he's superstitious. He didn't want to use the name of God, lest in using it he might accidentally bear the Lord's name in vain. Then down in verse 55, again, it's conclusive. All the people prostrated themselves, worshiping and praising heaven, that their cause had prospered. And it's just on and on and on and on throughout the book. Especially here in these first few chapters, though, you see this repetitive phrase. They're doing something about praying to heaven, thanking heaven. Heaven, saying that heaven forbid or whatever. So it shows that the author is a Jew, he's not a Gentile. And he's a good, religious, piously minded one, a superstitious one. We're going to see his descendants when we get later on over in the New Testament. Okay, let's come to the content of the book. It's made up of 16 chapters, a little bit longer than our book of Romans. And as I said before, it covers a period during the 2nd century BC, one of the most important periods in Jewish history from 175 BC to 135, from the ascension of Antiochus Epiphanes to the Seleucid throne in Syria to the reign of John Hyrcanus, who followed Simon, who followed Jonathan, who followed Judas, who followed Mattathias. We'll go through those names whenever we get to the book. They're the important names. So here in 16 chapters, we're talking about 40 years. I mean, it's good to know this so that you know what's going on in the book. We're talking about 40 years from the ascension of King Antiochus Epiphanes, who came after Seleucus IV, to the Seleucid throne in Syria, 175 BC, to the beginning of the reign of John Hyrcanus, 135. His reign doesn't end until 104. Now there's debate concerning the last few verses of 1 Maccabees. Are we talking about the beginning or the end of the reign of John? But we're just going to date it the beginning, because even if you're talking about the end of his reign there, which could well be, still no events are given to us for the years 135 to 104. So we're still only covering the period from 175 to 135. It's very, very reliable historically. Not that we can judge it against a lot of other history of this period, because we don't have any. But there's nothing that's inconsistent in the book. There's nothing that can be proven to be false by, let's say, records of the Greeks or the Persians or the Egyptians or anything else. And just a reading of the book by those who know how to read ancient history shows that the author, no doubt, is trustworthy and reliable. Now, the book from chapter 1 to chapter 16 is almost entirely composed of military events. The whole book is a military book of one battle after another battle after another battle. So it's certainly a military book. And it concerns the events with regard to Israel's quest for her independence from the Seleucid kingdom. She does go on to gain her political independence in 142 BC, which she keeps down until the time of the Romans around 63 BC, whenever Pompey comes into Palestine and conquers Jerusalem. So you have to kind of backtrack in your mind to the Assyrian kingdom, and then to the Babylonian kingdom, and the return of the exiles in 536, and then Zerubbabel going over to Palestine, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, you're down to 400 BC, and then you're just still talking about the Persians and the Medes before the Greeks come on the scene with Alexander around 323. Then he passes off the scene, as we'll see here in the first 3 or 4 verses of the book. His kingdom is divided up between 4 generals of his, or 3 generals and someone else who comes on the scene. And so you have a fight between the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom for Palestine, because she lay right in between Syria and Egypt, where these 2 kingdoms were located. And so, in other words, she, just like with the Babylonian captivity, she more or less has still been in captivity for years and years. So it's a very important period for Israel, because she finally is gaining her independence. Now, some people will date it back as early as 165, and that's true that she does gain a measure of independence back in 165 with the rededication of the temple on 25 Kislev with Judas Maccabeus. But still they go on and on and on, fighting battles down until 142, whenever Simon takes over in Israel. He becomes high priest, and things even in Israel are dated from the first year of the reign of Simon, which means that's an important time in Israel's history. And since that's 142, then that's where we'll date her independence, from 142 to 63 BC. Okay, an outline of the book. And then we'll get into looking at some of the important chapters and verses in the book. Stop me if you've got any questions on this. But we will be back over this in some other classes in the future. We'll be back over a lot of the material that takes place during the Maccabean or the Hasmonean dynasty. It's very important. You have to know a lot about First Maccabees, know a lot about Israel during this period, because remember, there aren't any biblical books that parallel First Maccabees. You've got Malachi, and then you've got Matthew. But we don't have a First Maccabees in our Bible in between there. You have to find your First Maccabees and study it so you can fit in some of the details that go before Matthew and come after Malachi. But even then, we're still only talking about from 175 to 135. So you're missing still centuries in between time. Chapter 1 of the book is a historical background of the Greek rule. A historical background of the Greek rule. The author of First Maccabees is a good writer. Before introducing his subject of the Maccabean family, he's going to give us some of the material that leads up to the need for the Maccabees to come on the scene and perform the exploits that they do. And then for convenience sake, I'll give you a threefold division of chapter 1. Verses 1 to 4, we have a history of the kingdom of Alexander the Great. Verses 5 to 9, we have a history that's not entirely true. He missed some of his facts here. But he didn't do it trying to deceive like the rest of the books in the Apocrypha will do. But anyway, we'll leave it as he gave it. We have a history of the fourfold division of the Greek Empire after Alexander's death. How many of you are at least a little familiar with what I'm talking about right now? Well, that's good. Because I know a lot about this period, and I could just go on and on. When you study the book of Daniel, then you just can't help but know a lot about how all of these things fit together. So it'd be easy just to go on. And you stop me if you don't know something about this period. We've covered, I guess, a little bit of this in Old Testament introduction as we got toward the post-exilic period. Then verses 10 through 64, the end of the chapter, and I think that last verse is one of those that's questionable in its translation. It's difficult to translate. But anyway, 10 to 64, we have the beginning of the wicked rule of Antiochus. Now there were a number of different people named Antiochus. If we just use the name by itself, we mean Antiochus Epiphanes. There's a lot of people named Mattathias, Judas, Jonathan, Simon, John, so there's duplicates of all of the names here. You have to keep straight on which one is which one. Antiochus, chapter 1, you can see his name in verse 10. Antiochus Epiphanes. Now he's mentioned in the book of Daniel, so we're not just talking about something we have to believe because Maccabees talks about it. He's not mentioned by name, but beyond a shadow of a doubt, Epiphanes is covered in the 11th chapter as well as other chapters such as 7 and 8 of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is a fascinating book. I'll be glad when we get to teach it one of these days. Because there's a wealth of prophetic material in Daniel's book. I guess that's one of the first books I got into whenever I got the baptism of the Holy Spirit was the book of Daniel. Because it's just so filled with these kingdoms and these beasts and crowns and horns and little horns and bears and leopards and all types of different figures and analogies there. And it's all prophetic. It's all talking about what's going to come about after the time of Daniel. And to understand that is to understand all of world history from the 6th century BC down to our day. Okay, that wraps up chapter 1 then. Chapter 2, we have an introduction to the Maccabean family. Under its initial leader, Mattathias. Mattathias is the father of the 5 sons who become important throughout the book. Judas is the most important one because he begins it all. Mattathias, you see his name spelled there in chapter 2 and verse 1. So that's all of chapter 2. It's just really an introduction to give us the history of how the move toward political independence came about in Israel. Then chapter 3 through chapter 9 and verse 22. We're going to start here with 4 of the 5 sons of Mattathias. You list their name out beside these divisions. There'll be 3 more divisions, and that will be all. 4 of the 5. Why don't we have the 5th son of Mattathias? What happens to him? What happens to old Eliezer? Well, you don't know the Apocrypha as well as you know your Bible. That's all right, though. See, if I ask you some question about the Bible, you could probably guess. Well, I'll show you what happens to him later on. So here we're talking about Judas. Chapter 3 through 9:22. See, a lot of you have read this evidently, but it probably doesn't make just a whole lot of sense to you because you don't know who all these names are. And you don't know what events are taking place here. 3 through 9:22, Judas. Then 9:23 through chapter 12, Jonathan. Then chapter 13 through chapter 16 and verse 17, Simon. Then chapter 16, verses 18 through 24, the end of the book, would be John. From history, we know him to be John Hyrcanus, although he's not mentioned by that name here. So we've really got these divisions. We've got chapter 1, the Greek rule, chapter 2, Mattathias, 3 through 9, Judas, and around 10 through 12, Jonathan, 13 through 16, Simon. And the last little section of 16 is a short chapter, but the last little section would be John. And these are 4 of the 5 sons, Judas, Jonathan, Simon, and John Hyrcanus of Mattathias. Okay, with all that behind us, let's look briefly at the book. So that now you can probably go read it again and you'll understand a lot more and it'll probably make a lot more sense to you. Starting back in chapter 1. We'll look a little here at the introductory history that the author provides us concerning the former Greek rule, first of all under Alexander. Now you can guess who he's talking about, but if you don't know beyond just the name, the full name, Alexander the Great, you wouldn't know who he's talking about because there are many, many Alexanders in the past. But since he's the son of Philip, Philip was king of Macedon, it has to be Alexander the Great. Alexander of Macedon, the son of Philip, marched from the land of Kittim. Now we're back around 323 BC in Greek history. He defeated Darius. Well, you've all heard of Darius, but the Darius in the Bible couldn't be the same as this one because your Bible ends before 323 BC, the Old Testament. But just like I said, there are many Alexanders, there are many kings in Medo-Persia by the name of Darius. Darius, king of Persia and Media, and seized his throne. And we're going to do a little study of the few battles because Darius came and met him at the Hellespont. There was a tremendous battle between Darius and Alexander, and then Darius had to retreat, and he fought him again, and then he retreated, and then he fought him again, and finally he lost. And all this was way over in Asia Minor, way over in Western Asia Minor. It wasn't that Alexander, even the way that he's got it here, if you don't know something about Greek history, it looks like Alexander went to Persia to fight Darius. But really Darius went to Turkey, and Alexander came to Turkey, and they fought there. And after winning several battles and working his way down into Palestine, then working his way down into Egypt, Alexander finally turns eastwardly and heads over into Persia, Babylon, and so forth. So here he's really summing up several different years and many different battles and a whole host of different geographical stops of Alexander, between him being in Macedon, which remember is the northern province of Greece, and him all the way over in Persia, Media, to seize his throne, being already king of Greece, he said. In the course of many campaigns, he captured fortified towns, slaughtered kings, traversed the earth to its remotest bounds. Alexander went all the way to India, which was just unknown for that day. someone traveling on land, from Greece all the way to India. He wanted to take India, but his men got tired of fighting. They talked him into going back to Babylon, where he died in a drunken stupor. And plundered innumerable nations. When at last the world lay quiet under his rule, his pride knew no limits. He built up an extremely powerful army and ruled over countries, nations, dominions, all paid him tribute. So there's a little introduction just to Alexander, because he's the great founding father of the Greek Empire. Then verses 5 to 9, we said, was the second division in chapter 1, where we have the fourfold division of the Greek Empire following the death of Alexander, which is summed up there in verses 5 and 6. He calls generals, divides the empire while he's still alive, and then he dies. And then down in verse 10, we've gone from around 312 BC, from verse 9, all the way down to 175 BC in verse 10. Just like in the Bible, the writers just skip lots of periods and times of history, and you have to know what's going on or you get confused. Now, for the evil characters, the most important man in all of the books of Maccabees would be Antiochus Epiphanes. So he's going to be introduced to us and then expounded upon from chapter 1 and verse 10 all the way to the end of the chapter, verse 64. That's how important he is. So it's the name Antiochus Epiphanes just to commit to memory, because that's how important he is. And he's covered right in the Bible. He's covered many times in the book of Daniel. And since we're talking about a book written around 100 BC, or better than that, we're talking about a man who begins his reign in 175 BC, then obviously with Daniel being written way back 6th century BC, then Daniel's book is prophetic, because we're talking about many centuries before Epiphanes even comes on the scene. And yet Daniel has him depicted quite well, even in his character traits, quite well, many centuries in advance. So let's start looking then, reading at verse 10, to show you a little bit about this old wicked King Epiphanes. A scion of this stock was that wicked man Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. He had been a hostage in Rome before he succeeded to the throne in the year 137 of the Greek era. Now, they're dating, the author of Maccabees is dating from the beginning of the Greek Empire, which is 313, 312. So you can kind of work your way from that date and find out what date he's talking about. You subtract 137 from 313, 312. And the dates, a lot of them anywhere, even provided for you if you've got a Bible like mine, and a footnote down at the bottom of the page. Now for some of these you have to add a 1 to get the correct date, but I don't think you have to here down at the bottom. Does yours have 175? Okay, that's the right date then. In other words, 137 of the Greek era would be 175 of the Christian era, dating according to Christ, 175 BC. Now starting with verse 11, we have a very interesting remark made about a group of irreligious Jews. He calls them renegade Jews, and they're called that other times. These evidently were apostate Jews who were turning away from the faith of their forefathers. And not only did the Seleucid kings cause Israel a lot of trouble during this time, but they had a whole lot of help with these irreligious Jews who were falling away from the faith. And look what they suggested. I mean, they're the very ones who suggested these things to the king. That time there appeared in Israel a group of renegade Jews who incited the people. Let us enter into a covenant with the Gentiles round about, they said, because disaster upon disaster has overtaken us since we segregated ourselves from them. That is, from Babylonian captivity. We should never have left Babylon, in other words. The people thought that this was a good argument. Some of them, in their enthusiasm, went to the king and received authority to introduce non-Jewish laws and customs. One of those being the most interesting one, they built a sports stadium in the Gentile style in Jerusalem. Well, it was a gymnasium where they all exercised in the nude, which was just common in Greece but was abominable among the Jews. So that's what this sports stadium was. It was a forebear of the modern day gymnasium. Yeah, gymnasiums had their origin in Greece, where everyone ran around in the nude. That's the way you exercise. You could exercise better with no clothes on. So he goes on saying they intermarried with the Gentiles and so forth. When he was firmly established on his throne, Antiochus made up his mind to become king of Egypt and so to rule over both kings. Now you see, you've got constant warfare in these centuries between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, between Syria and Egypt. And so Antiochus, ruling up in Syria, decides he wants to become king of both of these two final empires, remnants of Alexander's kingdom, both Syria and Egypt. He's already got one in Syria, so now he decides to go to Egypt. He assembled a powerful force of chariots, elephants, cavalry, a great fleet, and invaded Egypt. When the battle was joined, Ptolemy, king of Egypt, was seized with panic, took to flight, leaving many dead. Fortified towns were captured, so forth. You see then, getting down verse 20 through verse 24, he marches on his way back through Jerusalem on the temple, and he carries away the golden altar, the lampstand, the table for the bread of the presence, the sacred cups and bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and so forth. Remember, this had been restored by the kings of Medo-Persia whenever the exiles returned, according to Ezra chapter 1. All this was given to Zerubbabel. He stripped off all the gold plating from the temple front. He seized the silver, gold, precious vessels, whatever secret treasures he found. He took them all with him when he left for his own country. He had caused much bloodshed, and he gloated over all that he had done. And so here you see kind of a little lament, like the book of Lamentations, over Jerusalem. Great was the lamentation throughout Israel. Rulers and elders groaned in bitter grief. Girls and young men languished. The beauty of our women was disfigured. I think later on you read about the women running around with no tops on. They were so grief-stricken. Every bridegroom took up the lament. Every bride sat grieving in her chamber. The land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was wrapped in shame. Now remember, don't be reading over something like this and think about a false writer. This is very true to the account of what happened. Here you've got a nationalistically minded, piously minded Jew who's very, very upset over the bloodshed and over all that's been caused evil by Antiochus Epiphanes in Israel. Kind of like Jeremiah with his Lamentations. He certainly doesn't have the spiritual grounding that Jeremiah would have, but it's a moving book and a moving testimony to the terrible strait in which Israel found herself. Then jumping down to verse 54, this is all about what he's done, Antiochus Epiphanes, from verse 29 all the way down through 53, all the evil that he's done, that is in Israel. He has to introduce this before he introduces the Maccabees, because they're going to be the ones who overthrow the rule of Epiphanes. The 15th day of Kislev in 145, there you're going to have to add 1 to the number down at the bottom of the page to get the right date. He's entering the temple, sets up a terrible idol here. Verse 56, all scrolls of the law which were found were torn up and burnt. We discussed a little bit about this in Canonicity, that Israel had to, during this terrible time of persecution, maintain the existence of her religious books, her scrolls. Many, many of them were destroyed. Thus, month after month, these wicked men used their power against the Israelites whom they found in their towns. Verse 59, the 25th day of Kislev. They offered sacrifice on the pagan altar, which was on top of the altar of the Lord. Now that was the worst thing they could possibly do. Enter into the Holy of Holies, into Zerubbabel's temple, and offer a pagan sacrifice upon the Lord's holy, holy altar. Now that was the worst thing they could possibly do. Enter into the Holy of Holies, into Zerubbabel's temple, and offer a pagan sacrifice upon the Lord's holy, holy altar. In accordance with the royal decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, their babies, their families, those who had circumcised them, they hanged by the neck. And then here, look at verse 62. Starting here now, he's really going to gear our minds to the first verse of chapter 2 by introducing to us a remnant in Israel. He's going to name them Mattathias, John, Simon, so forth, whenever he gets to chapter 2. But look at verse 62. Yet many in Israel found strength to resist, taking a determined stand against eating any unclean food. They welcomed death rather than defile themselves and profane the holy covenant, and so they died. So he's kind of introducing to us this whole story that he wants to get into in chapter 2. So moving on to chapter 2, this time a certain Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, appeared on the scene. His home place is Modin, a little town a few miles northwest of Jerusalem. Verse 2 through verse 5 would be important because here we're introduced to the whole family of Mattathias. Now he's the elder, he's the father of this family. But he's going to die very shortly by the time we get, I think, to the end of chapter 2. And so he's going to need others, and we're going to need to have others to carry on his holy war against the Syrians. And so here they're introduced to us, and I mentioned their names before. Mattathias had 5 sons. John, called Gaddis; Simon, called Thassus; Judas, called Maccabees. And there is where we get the name for the whole book and the period. Maccabees for the book, Maccabean for the period. Now the family was not known. Their last name was not Maccabee or Maccabean or Maccabeus. This was a nickname of one of the sons, one of the brothers, Judas. I don't want to get into what all it can mean. We'll look at that some other time. But all of these evidently are nicknames for the sons. Gaius would be for John, Thassus would be for Simon, Maccabeus would be for Judas. Judas was the first of the brothers, and he was by far the most successful, because it was under the conquest of Judas that the temple was rededicated 3 years later, on 25 Kislev 165 BC. And so therefore he's the one who assumes the prominence in all of Jewish history afterwards. Eleazar, called Avron, and Jonathan, called Athas. So here are the 5 sons. Skipping down to verse 15. If you've got yours, just keep following along. You can be picking up these tidbits so you'll grasp the book better. Now we've already seen in chapter 1, we're going to start looking here at verse 15. We've already seen in chapter 1 how Antiochus Epiphanes has taken over Jerusalem. He's taken over the temple. But from verse 62 we see that many have not succumbed to the pressures of Hellenization, either by Antiochus, other Syrians, or by these renegade Jews that we looked at earlier there in chapter 1. And so since that's true, he's got to move beyond just conquering Jerusalem. He's got to get out in Palestine, get out in Israel, and work on some of these other towns. And so he goes to Modin. That's why Mattathias is introduced up there as being one, the end of verse 1, who settled at Modin, because this is where we're going to find one of the officers of the king going in verse 15. With that in mind, verse 15, the king's officers who were enforcing apostasy came to the town of Modin to see that sacrifice was offered, that is, pagan sacrifices. And many Israelites went over to them, that is, they became renegade Jews like the others. However, Mattathias and his son stood in a group. The king's officer spoke to Mattathias and said, "You're a leader here, a man of mark and influence in this town, with your sons and brothers at your back. Therefore, the point is, you be the first to come forward and offer your sacrifice so that all will, follow suit." Verse 19, to this, Mattathias replied in a ringing voice. And he really lets them have it down through verse 22. And so when the other people around see that Mattathias is not going to do it, then here we've got some old apostate Jew in verse 23. As soon as Mattathias had finished speaking, in that ringing voice of his, a Jew stepped forward in full view of all to offer sacrifice on the pagan altar at Modin in obedience to the royal command. You see, Mattathias is not going to do it. So some renegade Jew said, "I'll step out there and do it." The sight stirred Mattathias to indignation. He shook with passion, and in a fury of righteous anger rushed forward and slaughtered the traitor on the very altar. He says, "I'll offer a sacrifice for you. It'll be this apostate Jew here." The same time, he killed the officer, double sacrifice, sent by the king to enforce sacrifice and pull the pagan altar down. Thus Mattathias showed his fervent zeal for the law, just as Phinehas had done by killing Zimri, son of Salu. This was back in Numbers 25. Remember old Phinehas went after that man who came with that Midianitish woman right in the sight of all Israel and Moses when they were weeping at the door of the tabernacle to commit fornication with her. And old Phinehas took a javelin and thrust both of them through the stomach area. He said, "Follow me, every one of you, who is zealous for the law and strives to maintain the covenant." And so he took his sons to the hills, leaving all their belongings behind in the town. So here's the beginning of the revolt now. We've got a small group of men now following Mattathias, most notably all of his 5 sons. And they fled to the hills, and now they're going to conduct throughout the book guerrilla warfare against the Seleucid kings. And they're very, very successful at that. A lot of people have their military hints of guerrilla warfare and tactics right from 1 Maccabees. But yet, look at verse 32, about halfway through. We've got a battle fixing to be fought between the Syrians and these pious Jews. Yet they're so pious, one thing that they know they can't do is break the Lord's commandment concerning the Sabbath. On the Sabbath you can't work, which means you can't fight, because that would be to work. So the Syrians get real smart. They find out that they take one day a week off and don't do anything, including fighting, and they decide that's going to be the day we attack. So they prepared to attack them on the Sabbath. There is still time, they shouted. "Come out, obey the king's command, and your lives will be spared." "We will not come out," the Jews replied. They'd gone up into some caves and hid. "We will not obey the king's command or profane the Sabbath." Without more ado, the attack was launched, but the Israelites did nothing in reply. They neither hurled stones nor barricaded their caves. "Let us all meet death with a clear conscience," they said. "We call heaven and earth to testify that there is no justice in this slaughter." So they were attacked and massacred on the Sabbath, men, women, and children, up to 1,000 in all, and their cattle with them. So look at verse 39. "Great was the grief of Mattathias and his friends when they heard the news. They said to one another, 'If we all do as our brothers have done, if we refuse to fight the Gentiles for our lives as well as for our laws and customs, then they will soon wipe us off the face of the earth.' That day they decided that if anyone came to fight against them on the Sabbath, they would fight back rather than all die as their brothers in the caves had done." So here's a big change for them, and one that saves all of their lives. They decide that they're going to fight on the Sabbath, and this tactic will never work for the Seleucid kings again. And you see them fighting on the Sabbath. Well, verse 49, comes time for Mattathias to die. Down through verse 64, it gives us kind of a whole history of famous Jews. Then in verse 66, he appoints Judas Maccabees, one of his sons, to be leader in his stead whenever he dies. He said that he should be your commander in the field. So this brings us down to around 166 BC. Then I said from chapter 3 on through chapter 9 and verse 22, we have the history of Judas. Chapter 3 just made up of a lot of his battles that he's fighting, and he's very victorious. We see in verse 48, they're unrolling some scroll, one of those first 5 books of Moses, trying to find out some guidance from the Lord. They need some guidance around this time. Then in chapter 4, this maybe is the most important part of the book. Chapter 4, verse 36 through verse 59. Because Jerusalem, as well as the temple, had been in the hands of the Syrians now for exactly 3 years. Judas, his brothers, the others that have been fighting with them, have been making very successful guerrilla warfare against the Syrians, but it's been just over the hills and in the valleys and throughout the land of Palestine. What they've not been able to get back yet, but what is their chief aim to get back, is not only Jerusalem, but the destroyed temple itself, so that they can reconstruct some things there and rebuild it. And so this is what we have in verse 36. But Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been crushed, let us go up to Jerusalem to cleanse the temple and to dedicate it." So the whole army was assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the temple laid waste, the altar profaned, the gates burnt down, the courts overgrown like a thicket or a wooded hillside, and the priests' rooms in ruin. They tore their garments, wailed loudly, put ashes on their heads, and fell on their faces to the ground. So you see, they are a very piously minded group of people. Verse 41, then Judas detailed troops to engage the garrison of the citadel while he cleansed the temple. Now this citadel, I think it's been mentioned earlier, this was something that's a little confusing in the book. It was a Syrian fortification that had been built up on the hill of David back in chapter 1, if you look at verses 33 through 36. This evidently was the last thing to fall in Jerusalem, assuming that it fell at this time. It doesn't say, it just says that Judas detailed some of his troops to go engage the garrison, that is the Syrian garrison of the citadel, while he cleansed the temple. Then the rest of the chapter is talking about the temple, and we see the citadel mentioned later on. So maybe they just kept the Syrians off their back while they had time. It was some strong fortress. Well, you see it here in verse 33 of chapter 1. The city of David. Now, when it says that, it doesn't mean a city. It means a certain hill in Jerusalem. The city of David was turned into a citadel, enclosed by a high, stout wall with strong towers, garrisoned by impious foreigners and renegades, so that'd be Syrians and Jews. Having made themselves secure, they accumulated arms and provisions and deposited there the mass plunder of Jerusalem. And look at this last verse. There they lay in ambush, a lurking threat to the temple and a perpetual menace to Israel, which seems to mean that they stayed there throughout this whole period, but that Judas sends someone to ward off their fighting while they work on the temple. So back in chapter 4, we see them restoring the altar, 42 through 45. We've read verse 46 before. You remember this verse? They therefore pulled down the altar and stored away the stones in a fitting place on the temple hill until a prophet should arise who could be consulted about them. One of our 2 proof texts in 1 Maccabees to show that the period of prophetism had ended. Therefore, canonical revelation for Israel had ended. The writer of this book recognizes and admits that we're waiting until a prophet arises. They knew, according to Malachi, that a prophet was going to come. and they were waiting for the prophet. And then, the most important verse then of the whole book really be verse 52 of chapter 4. Early on the 25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev, in the year 148, which would be 165, not like your margin or footnote has 164, 165 BC, sacrifice was offered as the law commands on the newly made altar of burnt offering, which to the day 3 years before had been destroyed in 168 BC on 25 Kislev by Antiochus Epiphanes, which tells us that all of this guerrilla warfare has been going on for three solid years, from 165 or from 168 to 165. And so some people will try to date Israel's independence from 165. And that's okay as long as you recognize that she still goes on and fights these guerrilla warfares. We really don't have her total independence until later on, as we've mentioned. Verse 56, they celebrate the rededication of the altar for 8 days. Then down in verse 59, they make it a statute that the rededication of the altar, which really means the rededication of the temple. The altar was the important thing there, so they could offer sacrifice, which would appease God and atone for their sins, should be observed with joy and gladness at the same season each year for 8 days, beginning on the 25th of Kislev. Now, do any of you know where this is found in the New Testament? Well, let me show it to you. Because this was kept by the Jews afterwards, and it's mentioned one time. Of course, it couldn't be in the Old. We're already after the Old Testament. But it's easy to remember the verse. It's John 10, verse 22. It's only mentioned one time. You see, you'd read right over this in John 10 and not know that this was due to the Maccabees, to Judas Maccabeus. And it's known as the Feast of Dedication, which we're told here by John was in the winter, which is when Kislev is. It corresponds roughly with our December. December the 25th was the date for the rededication of the temple. See John 10:22, and it was at Jerusalem the feast of the dedication. And you'd read your Old Testament and say, well, what feast? That's not in the Old Testament. It's certainly not. But it's in 1 Maccabees, though. And it was winter. So it's the feast of the dedication of the altar, the rebuilding, refurbishing of the temple on 25 Kislev 165 BC by Judas Maccabeus, his brothers and comrades. Okay, moving back over to 1 Maccabees. We've already looked at chapter 3, chapter 4. Chapters 5 through 9, 22, we just got more battles of Judas Maccabeus. We can point out some interesting verses. Chapter 6. Oh yeah, chapter 6 and verse 8 through verse 13. Now we're going to have an account of the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, which I think I'll take time to read because he was public enemy number 1 in Israel during this time. So it's important for Israel that he dies, as well as the manner of his death. 1 Maccabees 6, 8 through 13. When the king heard this news, what he means there, King Antiochus has heard some news about one of his generals that he sent to Palestine has been routed by Judas and his band of guerrillas. So when he heard this news, he was thrown into such deep dismay that he took to his bed, ill with grief at the miscarriage of his plans. There he lay for many days, his bitter grief breaking out again and again. He realized that he was dying. He calls his friends and he says, "Sleep has deserted me, the weight of care has broken my heart. First I said to myself, why am I overwhelmed by this flood of trouble? I, who was kind and well loved in the day of my power." Well, that's hardly true. But look what he said here. And it's given to us in such a somber way, it must be true. And no one can prove that it's true. But it must be true, because here's a classic time where the writer of First Maccabees could really take off, raking old Antiochus Epiphanes over the coals for all that he's done wrong. And whenever we read a similar account over in Second Maccabees, you watch and see how that author just really invades against Antiochus Epiphanes, which kind of shows that you're not honest when you just take off like that. But he gives it to us just down to earth, matter-of-factly. Here's what Epiphanes said. But now I remember the wrong that I did in Jerusalem, when I took all her vessels of silver and gold, when I made an unjustified attempt to wipe out the inhabitants of Judea. It is for this, I know, that these misfortunes have come upon me, and here I am dying of grief in a foreign land. Verse 16, King Antiochus died there in the land in the year 149 or 162 BC. So evidently he had picked up from the Jews, or maybe it was just spur of the moment, God putting words in his heart, the thought of retribution, that as I've done, so it's being done unto me. So his armies turned over at this time to, I believe, Lysias, who was one of his favorite generals. And he goes on to, again, try to attack Judas. Battle, warfare is still going on, even though Jerusalem has been restored for the most part, maybe except the citadel, to the Jews. And in verse 34, we have the first detailed account of elephants ever being used in ancient warfare. Now, they've been mentioned earlier. They were mentioned way back in chapter 1, the first 10 or 15 verses in chapter 1. But here we've got elephants, and they really cause a lot of problem for Judas Maccabeus. You just don't have elephants running around in Israel. But they had elephants running around in Israel, and it was frightening a lot of the people. In order to get the elephants going, they gave them grape juice and mulberry juice. Yeah, that's in verse 34 of chapter 6. And it said that it really roused them for battle whenever they drank a big brimful of grape juice and mulberry juice. Verse 37, they had an Indian driver. Shows it came from India. These were Indian elephants. So this is a true account, a true story here. So getting down to verse 42, here's what happened. None of you could guess earlier. Here's what happened to that other of the 5 sons of Mattathias. He got squashed by an elephant. Judas advanced with his army and gave battle, and 600 of the king's men were killed. Eleazar Avaron, remember from chapter 2, verses 2 to 5, this is one of the 5 sons of Mattathias. He's one of the ones that we never mentioned as having a certain section in First Maccabees because he died. He didn't live long enough. Saying that one of the elephants wore royal armor and stood out above all the rest, and he figured out this must be where the king is. So he gave his life to save his people and win everlasting renown for himself. He ran boldly towards it, the middle of the phalanx, dealing death right and left while they fell back on either side before him. He got in underneath the elephant and thrust at it from below and killed it. It fell to the ground on top of him, and there he died. So there's the famous death of the famous Eleazar, got squashed by a big elephant. Now he knew, you see, they just were covered with all of this garb, but he knew where the soft spot was, get underneath the thing. But he should have thought to run after he stabbed. I guess he got praising God or heaven too much under there, and the elephant fell down on top of him. Chapter 7, more battles. Over to chapter 8, we've got the introduction of Rome. It says, now Judas had heard about the Romans. He knew that if you could become a friend of Rome, since they were at that time preparing to take over the whole world, then you'd be a friend of the greatest power on earth. And he recognizes that, so he sends some of his men to make peace with the Romans, which is exactly what takes place. It says there in verse 12, with their friends, however, and all who put themselves under their protection, they maintained firm friendship. And that was true of the Roman Senate. If you became their friend, then you remained their friend. Then over in chapter 9, verse 17, finally we have Judas himself dying. He falls in battle. Jonathan and Simon, two of his brothers, carried him off. They buried him in the family tomb at Modin and wept over him. Great was the grief in Israel, and they mourned for him many days. So his history ends in verse 22. So the fourth section of your outline was from chapter 9, verse 23, through chapter 12. And here we have Jonathan taking over leadership. Not only political leadership, but now for the first time he takes over religious leadership, as Jonathan has himself appointed high priest, which shows that they weren't exactly right in all that they did. Judas never had himself appointed high priest. But if you'll look over in chapter 10, the end of verse 20, and then all of verse 21, we're down to the year 152 BC. Jonathan becomes political leader, and he becomes religious leader as the high priest. This foreign king, Alexander, sent him a purple robe and a gold crown. Jonathan assumed the vestments of the high priest the 7th month of the year 152, the Feast of Tabernacles, which is not good. You see, by the time we get to Jonathan, now there are overtures made between the leaders of this rebellious group of Israelites, those who are rebelling against the Syrians, and the Syrian leaders themselves. There's a little bit too close of contact between the leaders rather than just all-out battle like we've had before with Judas Maccabees. Then I think we have to go all the way over to chapter 12 and verse 48 for the death of Jonathan. So chapter 13, we start the reign of Simon, which is in 142 BC. Simon takes over, again following in the footsteps not of Judas but of Jonathan. He becomes in the first place political leader, and in the second place religious leader by assuming upon himself the high priesthood. And he's probably the most important of these high priests, of the various sons that become high priests, depending on whether you want to weigh him against John Hyrcanus. But he's certainly more important than Jonathan, let me say that much. So for Simon, we have chapter 13 through chapter 16 and verse 17. Let me show you what's going on. Chapter 14, for instance, beginning with verse 4. This is why Simon was recognized as one of the best, because during his reign, as we mentioned before, they obtained political independence, 142 BC. Again, the bottom of your page has 141. Some of those dates you have to add one on to, which means that they're living during a time of great peace and prosperity for Israel. Verse 4 of chapter 14. As long as Simon lived, Judea was at peace. He promoted his people's welfare, and they lived happily all through the glorious days of his reign. Among other notable achievements, he captured the port of Joppa, and goes on to mention some other things, control of Gazra and Bethsura. Verse 8, they farmed their land in peace. They produced their crops. Verse 9, old men sat in the streets talking together of their blessings. The young men dressed themselves in splendid military style, playing military games, because the real fighting was over. His renown reached the ends of the earth. He restored peace. Each man sat under his own vine and fig tree, and they had no one to fear. Those were the days when every enemy vanished out of the land and every hostile king was crushed. Simon gave his protection to the poor among the people. He paid close attention to the law, rid the country of lawless and wicked men. He gave new splendor to the temple, furnished it with a wealth of sacred vessels, and so forth. So it's a period of great prosperity. And to recompense that, if you look over in verses 25 to 27, the people want to do something for Simon in return. And what is it? It's an inscription on bronze tablets that they set up at the temple that are dedicated to his honor. And that's why a lot of things are dated during this period of Israel's history according to the first year of the reign of Simon. Therefore, if you were 10 years later, you'd say in the year 10, because you'd be 10 years from the initiation of Simon's high priesthood. Verse 25, when the people heard these events, they asked themselves, how could they show their gratitude to Simon and his sons? For he, with his brothers and his father's family, had stood firm and fought off the enemies of Israel. That would be Mattathias, Judas, Jonathan, and so forth. And Eleazar, the one who the elephant sat on, and ensured his nation's freedom. So an inscription was engraved on tablets of bronze and placed on a monument on Mount Zion. A copy of the inscription follows. And he goes on to detail that from verse 27b through verse 47. So there's the prosperous reign of Simon. Then over to chapter 16, beginning with verse 11, we come to his death through verse 17. This period was filled with intrigue. Two people that we haven't met yet, Jason and Menelaus, that I think we'll meet over in 2 Maccabees, were two of the priests that came before Jonathan assumed the high priesthood. They came after Onias III. Onias III was a good high priest. And after Onias came Jason, and then Menelaus fought him for the high priesthood, and then Jason fought him back. You've got a lot of bribery and a lot of intrigue going on concerning who can be the high priest. So it's a terrible time during Israel's history. But for that, we're talking a little bit prior to the Maccabean era, a little bit after Onias III. But anyway, down to verse 11 of chapter 16. Now, Ptolemaeus, son of Abibus. Now, this Ptolemaeus had married a daughter of Simon, which got him into the family so that he could try to assume his father-in-law's position. Ptolemaeus, the son of Abibus, had been appointed commander for the plain of Jericho. He had great wealth, for he was the high priest's son-in-law, Simon's son-in-law, that is. But he became over-ambitious. He purposed to make himself master of the country and plotted to put Simon and his sons out of the way. In the course of a tour to inspect the towns in that region and to attend to their needs, Simon came to Jericho with his sons, Mattathias and Judas, in the year 177, the 11th month. The son of Abibus, with treachery in his heart, received them all. But he said that he had men in concealment, so that when Simon and his sons had drunk freely, Ptolemaeus and his accomplices jumped up, seized their weapons, rushed into the banquet. They attacked Simon and killed him along with his two sons and some of his servants. It was an act of base treachery in which evil was returned for good. So there you've got the end of Simon. And so the conclusion of the book, verses 18 through 24, we've got John Hyrcanus coming to the throne. It's during his period that we have and see the first mentioning of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And John was one at one time and then converted to the other sect later on. So it's a time for the origin of some of the New Testament sects of Israel, all the way down to the last two verses, 23 and 24. The rest of the story of John, his wars and the deeds of his valor he performed, the walls he built, his exploits, are written in the annals of his high priesthood from the time when he succeeded his father, which was 135 BC. Now these last two verses are a little ambiguous to determine whether the author of 1 Maccabees lived during the time of Hyrcanus or afterwards. Some people feel that he lives during the time. If he lived afterwards, since you've given us the history of Judas, Jonathan, Simon, why not give us the history of John? It makes a lot of sense. Why end right here? Why say that all of these deeds are written in some other book? Why not write them in your book? But at the same time, it seems like he's just summing everything up. You know, if you're living during the time of John Hyrcanus, you can only write up until whenever you're writing. Then if John Hyrcanus lives afterwards, and obviously he would have, then you couldn't cover all that. And yet the way he says in verse 23, the rest of the story of John, his wars, the deeds of his valor that he performed, the walls that he built, his exploits, seems like he's saying all that he did while he was leader, which would mean that the author of 1 Maccabees would have to be writing after his death. So there's no way that you can determine positively from these two verses. So going back to the date that I gave you earlier, where I said 100 BC, you may want to make a footnote that depending on how we should interpret these last two verses, it could be anywhere from, say, 120 to 100 BC. John Hyrcanus ruled from 135 to 104. So it has to be after 104 if he's summing up all of the events that John Hyrcanus had ever done. You've got to write after 104, either 103, 102, 101, 199, something. 100 is a good date to round it off. But if, as some people interpret, he's writing during the middle of the reign of John, then we're going to have to date the writing of the book around 120. So I just suggest 100 because it's easy to remember. No one really knows, and it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But 100 is probably easier to remember than 100 than 120. Now, in conclusion, turn over to the book of Daniel. And I'll show you some of Daniel's writing that happens to be covered in all of that mass of statistics that we just covered. Now we'll explain this more because Daniel 11's worse than 1 Maccabees. If you think that things are going to be talking over your head historically, you watch all this in Daniel. Let's start. If we start too early, it's too easy. So let's start with verse 5. If you start any earlier than that, it's kindergarten. But after that, it's very, very difficult. Now tell me who these people are. The king of the south. South of what? What's his name? Which one? There's thousands of them. Shall be strong, one of his princes. Well, who's that? And he shall be strong above him. Well, who above whom? And have his dominion, his dominion shall be a great dominion. The end of years, they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. They shall carry captives into Egypt, their gods with their princes, precious vessels of silver and gold. He shall continue more years than the king of the south. The king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. The king of the south shall be moved with choler, shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. When he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. And on and on and on. And we haven't even gotten to Maccabees yet. We have to get down to verse 22. With the arms of a flood shall they be overflown before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up, and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and the spoil and the riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. And on and on and on. So you can see practically all of Daniel 11 is filled with this all. The king of the south is going to have a daughter, and then the king of the north is going to do this, and then they're going to fight, and then someone's going to take this land, and then he's going to go down there in boats, and then he's going to come back, and then the king of the south is going to do this to the king of the north. And it's difficult to interpret. And then, how about when we get down to verse 38? But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces. The God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Well, I missed the verse. Oh, it's verse 37. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women. What's that? Nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. He shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. The time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north. So now we're not talking about one of those kings, because it mentions both of them here. They're both going to be after him. Whoever this him is shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land. Many countries shall be overthrown, but two are going to escape, Edom and Moab, as well as the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans and the Cushites shall be at his steps, and so forth. So we're talking about, what, 45 verses, Daniel chapter 11. And we'll share some quotes with you from some other people like Martin Luther about the importance of the books of Maccabees in light of Daniel chapter 11. How are you going to hope to interpret verses like that? You're at a loss, because not a single name is mentioned anywhere, not a single name. Never mentioned it. It just gives them by their geographical location. King of the north, king of the south. It never tells you who he's talking about. So it'd be not virtually impossible, totally impossible to ever hope to understand the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel without the first two books of Maccabees. So, in case you think, that's why I ended with that, in case you think, well, all this is boring stuff about Maccabees, you won't be able to understand Daniel 11 without the help and assistance of Maccabees. So Maccabees are some important books. Well, we're going to end there for this evening then. A lot of material, but Maccabees are interesting books. I enjoy both of them. The second one's more interesting than the first one. Generally, lies are. We had an unexpected delay in our Friday night teachings, so you're going to have to go back in your mind now. A couple of weeks ago, and it seemed like it was a little difficult, not to everyone, but to a large number of people here, what we were talking about in our message on an introduction to the Apocrypha. I'm not going to review all that since it is on tape, and you've had enough time to review your notes and think about what we had said. But I can say that since several of you are unfamiliar with many of these items, many of these books that we're talking about, then it may be a good idea to really study your notes so that you'll at least be ready for the next teaching whenever we're going to kind of build on something that's gone before. And also maybe the 2-week delay has given some of you time to obtain a copy of the Apocrypha. If not, it'd be a good idea to get one. You don't have to have one, but we're going to be reading some out of it. We're going to be reading a lot out of one of the books tonight. So it'd be good if you've got a copy so you don't have to just sit there and listen. That way you can follow along. Now, like I said, you can either get you some Catholic Bible that you used to have whenever you used to be lost, and you can bring that, and that's going to have some of the Apocrypha, not all of it, or you can get different editions of the Bible. I think the RSV prints their own edition of the Apocrypha, or the New English Bible, or just a book from a bookstore, I said, that by itself would contain the books of the Apocrypha. Or I guess your last option would be sit beside someone who's got a copy of the Apocrypha and read along with them. But we're talking about something that's influenced, a fifth of the world's population, because a fifth of the world's population is in the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's important that we know, and a lot, I've said before, a lot that is in the Roman Catholic Church is not in the Bible, but it is in the Apocrypha. That's exactly where they got some of their teachings. Superstitions was right out of the Apocrypha. At least that's where their foundation is, and they run to other verses in the canonical scriptures and say, well, see, this is just saying what the other parts of the Bible have to say. And what they mean by that is what the Apocrypha said is being reduplicated now over here in the canonical scriptures. Now, we were going to look at the books in a certain order according to 4 categories. I'll start by repeating that, and then we'll get into what we want to talk about, because we're going to finish up. Remember last time, 2 weeks ago, we didn't get through with an introduction to the Apocrypha, so we're going to finish that tonight before we start one of the individual books. We said we're going to look at 4 categories into which we've divided the, remember, anywhere from 14 to 18 books, depending on how you count them, of the Apocrypha. We're going to stay with the number 14 because it's easier and it's more prevalent. And the 4 categories according to their literary nature and according to their composition, their makeup. We said A, we're going to look at the historical books of the Apocrypha, which contains 1st Esdras and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. You need to be getting familiar along the way with these names. Obviously, they're strange if you haven't been in a church that used books like these before, because in all of the years you did your daily Bible reading, you never came across any of these names in your Bible because they weren't there. Then B, books of religious fiction. This is the largest group as far as the number of books. Tobit, Judith, that's a male and a female's name. The rest of Esther, or additions to Esther. The Song of the Three Holy Children. Many of the books have 1 or 2 or 3 or more names that the book can go by. The Song of the Three Holy Children, which also has the prayer of Azariah. The History of Susanna, or the Story of Susanna. And the History of Bel and the Dragon, or the History of the Destruction. Because that's what happens to old Bel and the Dragon. They get destroyed by Daniel the prophet. So Bel and the Dragon, or just Bel and Dragon, to shorten it. And from what I can remember, you can look on your outline and back me up by this. I think this is the order that we've got on the outline. I think this is the order we're going to be studying the books. I didn't look. I'm glad that it's true. Then C, wisdom books. And the 2 chief wisdom books would be Ecclesiasticus. Then another one under wisdom would be the Wisdom of Solomon. We know he's wise. The Wisdom of Solomon. And for lack of a better place, I stuck 2 other books under wisdom, Baruch and the Prayer of Manasses. We'll go ahead and call him Manasses since we're talking about Greek writings. Really his name was Manasseh. It ended with an H in the Old Testament, not with an S. But we're not calling the first book there on your list, 1st Ezra, the Hebrew name. We're calling him by his Greek name, Esdras, because that's what it's known by. So we'll go ahead and talk about Manasses instead of Manasseh. So we've got there under wisdom. And some people will say that Baruch and the Prayer of Manasses are really not wisdom writings. And that's kind of true, but neither are they historical. Neither are they religious fiction. Neither will they fit under the 4th category. So rather than invent a 5th one, you put them under wisdom. and there are some similarities because of the prayers that are prayed. And then the final category would be apocalyptic books. And that would have only one, second Esdras, which, remember, is only one of these not in the Septuagint. The Septuagint has 13 out of the 14. It doesn't have second Esdras. So you see, going back up to the historical section, that 1st and 2nd Maccabees will be studied together. We've got two groups of books that are 1st and 2nd. The other would be 1st and 2nd Esdras, but notice they're separated as far as they can be. 1st Esdras will be the first book we study, and 2nd Esdras will be the last one that we study, just because they fit under two of the different categories. 1st Esdras under the historical category, and 2nd Esdras under the apocalyptic one. Okay, I'm going to give you, next of all, now this starts new things tonight, the arrangement of the Apocrypha in the LXX. And we're going to come back now and say a lot more about the inclusion of the Apocrypha in the LXX, because a lot of false ideas, a lot of false doctrines based upon the fact that the LXX, which was the Jews' and the Christians' Bible for a period of time, contains the Apocrypha. But you've got to remember that we've got copies of the LXX that don't date back any earlier than, say, the 4th century A.D. And that's 6 centuries, 600 years after the Torah, the Pentateuch, was translated. And it's at least 5 centuries after the rest of the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek. And so who's to say, and many people are out there who will fill this slot, who's to say that back there 100 BC all of these apocryphal books were scattered throughout the LXX? We can say that they weren't because some of them weren't even written at that time. But they use that as an argument for the two canon theory. There was an Alexandrian and a Palestinian canon, but we'll cover that later on. So here's the arrangement as they stand in the manuscripts of the LXX, the Septuagint version that we have today. 1st Esdras comes right before Ezra. That would only make sense. You can have 1st Esdras, then Ezra, then Nehemiah, then Esther. The books of Maccabees come after the prophets. On rare occasions you can find a 3rd and a 4th Maccabees. I think there's even a 5th one in some other language, like the Arabic language or something, but that hardly ever comes into play. And neither do the 3rd and 4th books of Maccabees. All they come according to their contents and when they were supposed to have been written before the time of 1st Maccabees. So Maccabees would come after the prophets. Judith and Tobit, those books are very, very similar. They deal with very fanciful religious fictional ideas. So they go together. Judith and Tobit follow the book of Esther. So they'd come in our Bible between Esther and the book of Job. So you'd have 1st Esdras, then Ezra, then Nehemiah, then Esther, then Judith and Tobit, then Job. Okay, additions. We've got 4 books that we're going to call books of addition. Let me explain that for those of you that don't know, so you'll know what I'm talking about as we go along later on. We have them separated in our 14-book classification into 4 entirely distinct and separate books. You're not going to find it that way in many different Bibles. You won't find it that way in Old Catholic Bibles. They're not separated like that. So let me tell you what the additions are. First of all, we have what we call the additions, or the rest, R-E-S-T, of Esther, which means our book of Esther is incomplete. Now notice that if I say the rest, you don't know whether it's singular or plural additions. If I say additions, right away you know it's plural. You could speak of the rest of Esther, or the additions to Esther, as being either one addition or as many as 6 additions, or additions I should say. We're going to call it 1 because, and you'll understand this more whenever we get to the rest of Esther, because what it amounts to are a number of different segments of apocryphal material that's just been inserted sporadically throughout the book of Esther. It's not It's not segments of material that deal with different distinct ideas that make a whole complete story in themselves, like we're going to see with the book of Daniel, the additions to the book of Daniel. Esther is just a few verses here, a few segments there, slipping in the name of God here and slipping in another religious idea here and there, just spread on at least 6 occasions throughout the book of Esther. So it's known as the rest of Esther, or the additions. You can see how it could be plural. Or you can sum all of those singular 6 additions up, just put them together and say this is the one addition that's been made in the apocryphal books to the book of Esther, which is more or less what we're going to do. So there's one book of additions. Then the other 3 are found with regard to Daniel. The 3 additions to Daniel. Now, so you see, some of you didn't know this, some of you did. The 3 additions to the book of Daniel are the Song of the 3 Holy Children, as well as the prayer of Azariah. So we're going to put those together. We're just going to call it the Song of the 3 Holy Children, the history of Susanna, and the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. Now you see, we're going to count those as 3 books. Now remember, a book doesn't have to be 500 pages for it to be a book. Just look at 2 John, look at 3 John, look at Obadiah, look at Jude. Sometimes they can be very short. Now, these are very, very short. We're still going to count them, though, as an entire book, although in many editions, such as the Catholic Bible, you're not going to find those separated. You're going to find them all together with the canonical book. Obviously, you're going to find it that way. That adds more believability to what you're trying to get across, the material you're trying to slip into the Scriptures. And so the prayer of Azariah, as well as the Song of the 3 Holy Children, comes between the 23rd and the 24th verse of Daniel chapter 3. So you see, that's why we call it an addition to the book of Daniel. And in the Catholic Bibles and other Bibles, we're not just speaking of that, you'll find it between Daniel 3:23 and Daniel 3:24. There's a whole section of material where you say, what's it about? It's this prayer that Azariah prays, and it's a song the 3 holy children sing while they're in the furnace after Nebuchadnezzar has thrown them in. And it's stuck between the 23rd and the 24th verse of our canonical book of Daniel in his 3rd chapter. So there you see that that's an addition to the book of Daniel. Then in the second place, the history of Susanna is chapter 13. All we have are 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. The history of Susanna would be chapter 13. And the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon would be chapter 14. So in other words, the apocryphal book of Daniel would have our 12 chapters as well as 2 additional ones, 13 about Susanna and 14 about Bel and dragon. And then it also would have a whole interpolation between verses 23 and 24 of chapter 3, which makes the book of Daniel quite a bit longer than our book of Daniel. So that's where it's also found, by the way, in the Septuagint. They're found in the same places there. So we call those 4 books or segments, whatever you want to call them, the additions to the book of Esther and the additions to the book of Daniel. Okay, moving along with the LXX arrangement, we have Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus right after the Wisdom books in our Old Testament, which would be after what book? The Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon. So Wisdom would be the next book after the Song, and then Ecclesiasticus would be the next book after Wisdom. What would be the next book after Ecclesiasticus? Isaiah. Okay, Baruch, where would you think Baruch would come? After Jeremiah. So we've got our 52 chapters of Jeremiah, then you've got Baruch, which is 6 chapters, or 5 if you want to count the last chapter as the Epistle of Jeremiah. Remember, we're going to put both of those together. We're not going to separate Baruch and the Epistle, and we're not going to separate the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the 3 Holy Children. So Baruch comes after Jeremiah, and the prayer of Manasseh is in an appendix to the LXX. Instead of being stuck back in Kings or Chronicles or wherever, they just add it on as an appendix. Now you're going to find pretty much the same arrangement in Catholic Bibles, in the old Latin Bibles, except Tobit and Judith precede the book of Esther instead of follow it, and the books of Maccabees come a little bit earlier. But that's no big deal because you probably got a table of contents and you can look them up yourself. Now some of these books, as we've already said, some of these books are not in the Catholic Bibles, and some of these books are not in the LXX. One's not in the LXX and 3 aren't in the Catholic Bible, but we're going to go ahead and study all 14 of them as being the 14 recognized apocryphal works. Now for the most part, Protestants and Jews don't accept, and never have accepted any of these books as canonical. The Catholics, just the opposite end of the spectrum, do accept the vast majority of them, 7 according to the Catholics. It would be 11 according to us, as we'll explain later. And they call these books deuterocanonical. They don't come right out and call them these apocryphal books like Protestants do. They speak of these books that they accept beyond the strictly canonical ones as being deuterocanonical. And then what the Protestants call the pseudepigrapha, the Catholics call the apocrypha. Again, it ends up being a semantic argument over terms. And if you don't know these things, that's why I'm telling you this, if you don't know these things, then whenever you read others' writings, they're talking about something that you're not talking about when you both use the same word. That's why we gave you an explanation of the usage of the term apocrypha. Someone else can use that term and mean something different by what you mean whenever you use the term. And so you're reading in a different ballpark. If you open a book up that's written by a Catholic that says, an introduction to the Apocrypha, and you think we're really going to study about First Esdras and the prayer of Manassas and all this. No, you're going to study the pseudepigrapha because they call things by different names. Okay, one more thing in introduction. I want to give you the title to 4 books, 4 of the best-known scholarly books that have been written on the Apocrypha, all of which you can still obtain somewhere today, even if you have to buy a used copy. The first, the best-known, the monumental, the classic until just a few years ago, is entitled The Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. Written by R.H. Charles in 1913. The Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, R.H. Charles, 1913. Secondly, the Apocryphal Literature by C.C. Torrey in 1945, giving you the date that the books were published. Number 3, A History of the New Testament Times with an Introduction to the Apocrypha. 1949, by R.H. Pfeiffer, P-H-E-I-F-F-E-R, R.H. Pfeiffer, A History of the New Testament Times with an Introduction to the Apocrypha. Notice there it's connected to the New Testament, not to the Old, because some people try to connect some of the statements in the Apocrypha with some of the statements in the New Testament, as well as some of the Jewish parties, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And then probably the best known of the recent ones would be An Introduction to the Apocrypha, 1957, by B.M. Metzger. And most of the material that you're going to find here in these 3 books is going to be not of the conservative persuasion. So I have to let you know ahead of time if you get any of the books or have any of them. It's going to definitely be of the liberal persuasion, the vast majority of what you're going to read. Now, the books have a lot of good information about the Apocrypha that's going to be true whether you're conservative or liberal, but all writers are known to do, whether you're conservative or liberal, they're known to, whenever they have the opportunity, slip in a point in their religious favor. You can't help but do that if you're the author of the book. So you're going to find a liberal bias in the majority of the pages in these 4 books. Well, that's all I see for introduction. If no one has any questions, we're going to go on and start looking at some of the books individually then. Let me go back over that again. The Catholics call what we call the Apocrypha their deuterocanonical books. And secondly, what we call the pseudepigrapha, they call the Apocrypha. So it's just a confusion of terms of Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha is what it amounts to. We're going to study the pseudepigrapha, but we're going to have to keep that entirely distinct from the Apocrypha. People talk about there being a New Testament Apocrypha, and it's true if you use that word in some of the senses that we've talked about it before, but the Apocrypha, just that name, down to this day, has come to mean these 14 books that we're going to be talking about. So we're not going to confuse the issue by studying the Apocrypha, and then later on, when we come to the pseudepigrapha, we're going to talk about these apocryphal New Testament books. It just becomes too confusing. So maybe I need to pause and say a word about that. What we're going to do will be to look at the Apocrypha, these 14 books. Then later on, once we're through with that, we're going to look at the pseudepigrapha. And the pseudepigrapha will have 2 divisions, the Old Testament pseudepigrapha and the New Testament pseudepigrapha. In other words, for the Old Testament days, we're going to have an Apocrypha and a pseudepigrapha that we're going to cover. For New Testament days, we're not going to have an Apocrypha. Whatever anyone else calls apocryphal New Testament books, we're going to sum all those up under pseudepigraphal New Testament books so that we don't have to keep using the word Apocrypha to refer to more than one item, because it just becomes too confusing. It's going to be confusing enough, swapping around Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha in the AD and BC years without adding something more that we really don't need. Well, you already know from your outline, we're going to start then with the book of 1st Esdras. We've said before it's known as 3rd Esdras in the Latin Bible because they call our Ezra 1st Esdras, our Nehemiah their 2nd Esdras, and then what we're going to refer to as 1st Esdras as their 3rd. But it's called 1st in the LXX, and it's always been called 1st in Protestant usage. Sometimes it's not Esdras, sometimes it's 1st priest, because we know that Ezra was a priest or a scribe. On rare occasions you find the book titled as 1st priest and 2nd priest, but that's very rare. Probably nobody in here even knew that, so there's no sense in telling you things you don't know. What you don't know won't hurt in some areas, as they say. Some areas, only in some. You might not know about Jesus, but that'll hurt you tremendously.
Amen.
But it won't hurt you that you don't know about 1st and 2nd priests, and just another thing to clutter your mind. Now let me make this statement about the book of 1st Esdras. It's going to be a little difficult to cover this because we're not just talking about Acts 10:38 and 1 John 4:4 and John 3:16 and Acts 2:4 and all these passages we can all quote. We're talking about things that none of us can quote from because we don't sit home reading these things, quoting, memorizing the promises out of them all the time. So it's going to be a little difficult. You're going to have to pay attention, and hopefully I can keep everything straight so you can pay attention. It becomes confusing, well, you're going to see just in trying to break down the book of 1st Esdras. But here's a statement I want to make. To remember, some of the books are known particularly for one particular thing. And we can say this about 1st Esdras, that none of the apocryphal books is as closely linked to the canon of Scripture, that is, to the Old Testament canon of Scripture, as this book, as the book of 1st Esdras. Why? Because most of the book, the vast majority of the book of 1st Esdras, is nothing but direct quotations right from our Old Testament with some minor variations. Amen. So that's going to save us a lot of time. We're not going to study We're not going to study, by the way, any of the apocryphal books in a verse-by-verse fashion. We haven't even done that to the Word of God yet, every book verse by verse. So we'd be way off basis if we hadn't even studied the true canonical books, every one of them verse by verse, and we're already into the apocryphal verse by verse. We're going to kind of go chapter by chapter or theme by theme. But even if we were covering it particularly, we could skip over just a large section of it because it's found right in our Old Testament. In 2 Chronicles, in the book of Ezra, and in one small portion of the book of Nehemiah. Therefore, to study that would be the same as studying, let's say, the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, or the first half of Nehemiah, chapter 8, or of the whole book of Ezra, because there are direct parallels between what we have in 2 Chronicles, in the book of Ezra, our book of Ezra in the canonical scriptures, as well as the last verse, I believe, of Nehemiah 7, verse 73, and the first 12 verses of Nehemiah chapter 8, which means it's going to be directly the same. Except there are some minor variations, and those variations point us away from the book because they're not in agreement with 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So, like I just said, it contains the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, and I'll give you any exceptions here in a moment. It contains all of the book of Ezra. See, you probably didn't know that. First Esdras has all 10 chapters of our book of Ezra, just the same. So we're not going to waste a lot of time studying that, because to study that would be to study the book of Ezra. And we're not talking about Ezra, we're talking about apocryphal literature now. So we're going to stay, in other words, with these sections. There's only one. From chapter 3:1 to chapter 5 and verse 6, I believe. There's only one section here that's new. And that's the only section that we're going to read in detail and comment some on. So the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, all of the book of Ezra, the first half of the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. This will be what you want to get notes down on all of this, because it's just too difficult to memorize. It's too much material to memorize. So as long as you've got it in your notes, and that's really all that you need. Okay, let's say a thing or two about the author of the book. What have we said thus far about the authorship of the Apocryphal? Nothing. We don't know anything about him except one book as far as the author goes. As far as who the author was, like we can pinpoint many Old Testament books. We can specifically pinpoint many New Testament books. And it's just not true with the Apocrypha, which is one of the things that hurts its claim to canonical status. But this we can say. The author was no doubt a Jew. He probably lived in Palestine. From a verse over in chapter 5, verse 47, I think he's mentioning in chapter 5 and verse 47 particular layout of the city. He talks about a certain gate that points to a certain direction, and talks about a square and a market that's there. Evidently he knew what he was talking about, because some of these authors, they have such an Alexandrian flavor, it appears as though they resided in Egypt and not in Palestine. He was familiar with other Old Testament books, we can see, particularly with the book of Esther and with the book of Daniel. We see this from the first 3 verses of chapter 3. I'll read these to you. Now, if you've got First Esdras along, then you need to be turning along with us. Maybe by next week all of you will get one, so you can get involved in what's going on. So we'll be over in First Esdras chapter 3. Now you see if you don't see a connection here. The one with the book of Esther is a lot more notable. Now remember, do you remember what the date for Esther is? When did she live? Well, think about it. Look it up somewhere. I won't spoil the fun and tell you ahead of time. But then it's going to tell you something about this author. He couldn't have lived prior to that, or how is he making a reference right to, or looks like right to, the book of Esther? We're talking about a time just a little bit before Ezra, like around 475 BC. Okay, here's chapter 3 and verse 1. King Darius held a great feast for all those under him, his household, the chief men of Media and Persia, the satraps, the commanders, the governors of his empire, in the 20 and 7 satrapies from India to Ethiopia. Look over in the book of Esther. Isn't this what we find here to start off with? Look at the first verse of the book of Esther. And it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Now right away we've got a problem because we just read that King Darius made this feast. But it's really not so much of a problem as long as you don't try to draw a connection in time between the two. Because he's talking about a different time. Which Darius is he talking about? Of course, if he's talking about Darius, then we're talking about several years before Ahasuerus, which was the other name for Xerxes. He came quite a bit before. You're talking about Darius the Mede, and we're back before the time of Smerdis. You're talking about Darius Hystaspes, we're talking about after the time of Smerdis and just before the time of Xerxes. So it's going to make all the difference in the world. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus which reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 107 and 20 provinces. That's just what we read here. So there's some connection. Okay, then verse 3 of chapter 3. When they had eaten and drunk their fill, they went away, and King Darius withdrew to his bedchamber. He went to sleep, but woke up again. Well, all you got to do is read the first few chapters of the book of Daniel, and that's what Daniel's book is about. Every time Nebuchadnezzar is going to sleep, he has this series of dreams and visions. And something's going to happen here, you see, whenever King Darius goes to sleep. That's why they're getting him to sleep. People have wondered why he woke up again when it's really not time for him to wake up yet. That's been a problem right away with the book of 1 Esdras. So anyway, it appears that the author, we're talking about the author, knew of other Old Testament books. And there are some other allusions, but those are two easy ones to see. It does not appear that the author lived, however, during the Persian period. Now remember, the author more or less is claiming to be Ezra. That's how the book got its name. First Ezra is more or less claiming to be Ezra. We know that Ezra did live during the Persian period, but he makes a historical blunder of the first rank in swapping up indiscriminately the name Medes and the Persians and Persians and the Medes. And if you were living during that time, you'd never swap them up indiscriminately like that. You would keep them either the Medes and the Persians or the Persians and the Medes, as we find in our canonical books. But he swaps them up, sometimes refers to them as the Medes and the Persians, and sometimes as the Persians and the Medes. Now you might not see what we're saying, but what I'm saying is the Medes and the Persians, that means we're talking about the Persian period when this writer allegedly was giving forth this material. But with him swapping things up like that, it shows us right away that he did not live during the Persian period, which shows us right away he probably lived many centuries after that. And he's looking back just like the author to the book, The Wisdom of Solomon. He's looking back in time and trying to put his material back as though it was written, let's say, the middle of the 5th century B.C. That's when the book is supposed to have been written, the middle of the 5th century B.C. Because we're right during the time of the period of the Persians and the Medes. And yet because he's swapping these things up, then we've got problems with when he purports to have written the book and when he purports to have lived. If that's wrong, then what I'm saying is he's lying to us. Or he's fostering a misconception, to say the least. And since we know the Spirit of God doesn't inspire that, then he couldn't have inspired the book. Very easy to deduce the non-canonical status of many of these writings. And then some of the things we're going to say about the others, it'll be a lot more obvious in what I've just said about 1 Esdras. Okay, the chief thing we need to do is get the book divided up so that if you don't have 1 Esdras, but you do have your Old Testament with you, you can follow along. The book of 1 Esdras has 9 chapters. Now our Ezra has 10, our Nehemiah has 13, our Esther has 10, just to keep you familiar with that. It has 9 chapters. It's an incomplete book, by the way. We'll come to this whenever we get to the end, because the very last sentence of the book shows us that it's incomplete. But since I said that the book of 1 Esdras comprises the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, the entire book of Ezra, with the exception of one verse, and for the most part the first half of Nehemiah chapter 8, then I want to show you where the parallels are. So I'm going to give you, 8 points about the book of 1st Esdras on how we're going to parallel that to 2nd Chronicles, to the book of Ezra, which will be the most difficult thing, and then to the first half of the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. So, 1st Esdras chapter 1, we're going to give you the parallels, I'm saying, between it and our canonical books. If you don't have 1st Esdras 1, that's all right. Do you have 2nd Chronicles 35 and 36? Then they're the same thing. Now, when I say the same thing, I mean in essence they're the same. There are historical mistakes. There are chronological mistakes right here in the book of 1st Esdras, multitudes of them. And they're so small, we're not going to look at all of those. But when I say that it's the same, I mean that, well, let me turn. You turn to 2nd Chronicles 35:1. And I'll turn to 1st Esdras chapter 1 and verse 1. I don't know what yours says, but here's what mine says. Josiah kept the Passover at Jerusalem in honor of his Lord, and sacrificed Passover victims on the 14th day of the first month. The priests, duly robed in their vestments, he stationed in the temple of the Lord according to the order of daily service. He commanded the Levites who served the temple in Israel to purify themselves for the Lord, in order to place the holy ark of the Lord in the house which was built by King Solomon, son of David. Now, doesn't that read very similar to what I'm saying? All right, then. So all you've got to do is turn over to those last 2 chapters. Now, the only exception would be the last 2 verses of 2nd Chronicles 36. Because as we pointed out, I think, in Old Testament introduction, those last 2 verses of 2nd Chronicles 26 are duplicated in the very beginning of the book of Ezra. So, in other words, 1st Esdras has simply dropped that, since 1st Esdras contains our entire chapter 1 of the book of Ezra. There'd really be no need to duplicate the last 2 verses of 2nd Chronicles 36. You have to just shout, heart attack, or praise the Lord, or help now if I've lost you somewhere along the way. So what I'm saying is, 1st Esdras chapter 1 is the same as 2nd Chronicles 35 and 36, except the last 2 verses of 2nd Chronicles 36. Okay, number 2. 1st Esdras chapter 2, verses 1 to 15 equals our Ezra 1. Difficult to study 1st Esdras unless you know how it's broken down like this. Okay, you can turn to Ezra 1 and verse 1. So we've just skipped all of 1st Esdras chapter 1, 58 verses, which are the same as all those verses in 2nd Chronicles 35 and 36 because they're the same. So to study this would really not be studying the Apocrypha, would be studying 2nd Chronicles then. Okay, here is how it goes. During the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, in order to fulfill his word spoken through Jeremiah, moved Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his empire, which he also put into writing. Does that read like the beginning of Ezra? Then we can skip that. The third place, chapter 2 and verse 16 through the end of the chapter, verse 30. Now here's where it really gets confusing, and here's where the author's made his mistakes, which I think we'll point out whenever we come back, if we've got time. Corresponds with Ezra 4, 7 to 24. See, now that would really throw you for a loop, because he's going right in order: 2nd Chronicles 35, 2nd Chronicles 36, Ezra 1, but now he doesn't have Ezra 2. He's got to first of all introduce this man Zerubbabel as being known by that name before he can give us Ezra 2, because I think it's the 2nd verse of Ezra 2 who introduces Zerubbabel by that name. And since 1st Esdras hasn't introduced him yet, then he feels that'd be invalid to introduce him or to start telling the story about him without giving us his name to begin with. Okay, in the 4th place, chapter 3 and verse 1 through chapter 5 and verse 6 is the most important section of 1st Esdras. That's what we're going to spend some time looking at. This is the only original part of the book. By original, I mean it's not a duplication of Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So we're talking about 2 whole chapters, all of chapter 3, all of chapter 4, the first 6 verses of chapter 5, are what constitute what we might call the original germ of the book. That's all of 1st Esdras, is 3:1 through 5:6. Until he wanted to spice everything up and draw some other material out of the Bible to get what he was thinking that he had, which was a chronological framework, which he made a serious blunder, which we'll point out whenever we come back if we have time. Okay, then in the 5th place, we have chapter 5 and verse 7 through the last verse of that chapter, which is 73. It's a long chapter. Now we've got to go back and pick up the early portions of Ezra. See, we skipped from 1 to 4. So now we're going to go back and pick up everything in between that, with one exception. One verse, the last verse of what we would be picking up in its entirety, which would give us Ezra 2:1 through Ezra 4:5. Then I'm going to break this down into 3 sections to show you where the chapters of Ezra's book are found. So 5:7 through 73 equals Ezra 2:1 through 4:5. So what do we have there? We've got Ezra chapter 2, we've got Ezra chapter 3, we've got the first 5 verses of Ezra chapter 4. So that's what I want to correspond now. So this will be several points under the 5th one that I've just given you. 5:7 through 46 is Ezra chapter 2, the whole chapter. And you remember how long Ezra 2 is. Look at that. We're talking about 70 verses now in Ezra 2. It's a long chapter. And he does it this way so that he can do what he wants to with this man Zerubbabel, which is what the whole story and the whole book of 1st Esdras is about. Then we've got verse 47 through verse 65, all of chapter 5, which equals Ezra 3. Then we've got verse 66 to the end of the chapter, 73, which would equal Ezra 4, verses 1 to 5. Then we've got verse 66 to the end of the chapter, 73, which would equal Ezra 4, verses 1 to 5. Okay, the 6th place, Esdras 6:1 through 7:15. So we're talking about 2 chapters now, because I think verse 15 is the end of chapter 7. Chapter 7 of 1st Esdras, I believe, is the short chapter. We'll see whenever we get there. 6:1 through 7:15 equals Ezra 5:1 through 6:22. So we're talking about a couple of chapters there. That is in the book of Ezra, chapter 5 and chapter 6. So let me give you 2 points under number 6 to show you where Ezra 5 and 6 are found. First Ezra 6:1 through 22 equals Ezra 5. And then 6:23 through 7:15 equals Ezra chapter 6. Then in the 7th place, we've got 1st Esdras 8:1 through 9:36. Equals Ezra 7:1 through 10:44. How far does that take us in Ezra? All the way. It takes us to the end of the book. So I'm going to give you 4 points under this. We've got to get chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 out of the book of Ezra to correspond to some of these verses between chapter 8 and verse 1 and chapter 9 and verse 36 in the book of 1st Esdras. So 8:1 through 27 corresponds to Ezra 7. 8:28 through 67 corresponds to Ezra 8. 8:68 through 90 corresponds to Ezra 9. And 8:91 through 9:36 corresponds to Ezra 10. Now that only gives us number 8, one more point to go. And here we've got the last chapter, second half of it in 1st Esdras, 9:37 through 55. 9:37 through 9:55. And what does that correspond to? Okay, only thing we hadn't done yet is Nehemiah. Really what he did, he took the last verse of Nehemiah 7, which is verse 73. So really it's from Nehemiah 7:73 through Nehemiah 8 and verse 12. Again, it's a mystery why he's stuck on verse 73, because when you go back up to, say, verse 69 or verse 70, we're talking about a whole segment in the end of this long 7th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. Why take the last one? Nobody knows. Now, we left out, see how you're following that maze, we left out one verse in the book of Ezra. There's only one verse in the whole book.
What's verse 6?
Verse 6 of what? Of chapter 4. It's a very interesting verse. He probably left it out for a reason. That's where he got really messed up, is when he got around, well, anywhere from Ezra 4:6 to Ezra 4:24. Verse 24, I believe, is the end of Ezra 4, the last verse of the chapter, especially when you get to verses 23 and 24. He was running into some problems. So the only verse of Ezra that's not in 1st Esdras is Ezra 4 and verse 6. Now, I told you earlier that 1st Esdras ends incompletely. It ends right in the middle of a sentence. So it's been hypothesized, it's more than a hypothesis, we don't have the whole book. It's never been found down to this day. The rest of the book has not been found. So, since you might not have 1st Esdras, therefore you would have the 9th chapter and the 55th verse, then you can turn over to what? Nehemiah 8 and verse 12. Turn over to Nehemiah 8 and verse 12. Some of you are following along. I know it's difficult. It's a whole maze. But now if you've got 1st Esdras, you can read it and know what it's corresponding to. You see how difficult it is to piece all that together. It's very difficult. I better turn over there. I don't remember exactly what it says. I don't know if it's the 12th verse or did he start the 13th one.
13.
Okay, he's starting the 13th. We've got verse 12. You look at verse 12 and I'll read towards the end of 1st Esdras. So they all departed to eat and drink and make merry, and to send shares to those who had none, and to hold a great celebration, because the teaching given them had been instilled into their mind. That's in essence what verse 12 is saying. Then verse 13. And on the 2nd day were gathered together of the chief fathers of all the people, the priests, the Levites, unto Ezra the scribe, even to understand the words of the law. Well, there's the first phrase. And on the 2nd day were gathered together the chief of the fathers. Well, here's the last thing in 1st Esdras. They gathered together. Period. Now, of course, that could be the end of the book. You could think, well, he's just talking about this final grouping here. But when you look there at that 13th verse of Nehemiah 8, you know that what the book originally had was verse 13, probably verse 14. We don't know how much more of the book of Nehemiah. Maybe even got real bold and went back and got Ezra 4:6 and put it in his book. Probably not, but he at least probably had some more of the book of Nehemiah. Which doesn't matter to us because we've got the book of Nehemiah. We don't need the extra material added on there. All we need is chapter 3:1 through chapter 5 and verse 6. Now he never mentions Nehemiah by name, which is obviously one of the mistakes of his book, since Nehemiah does mention himself by name. Now Nehemiah really couldn't be mentioned in the book of Ezra because remember Ezra, we're dating around 458 BC and Nehemiah around 445. And Nehemiah's book does have Ezra, but Ezra's book couldn't have Nehemiah because it came before. But when you get over to Nehemiah, when you get over to Nehemiah chapter 8, now we're talking about Ezra and Nehemiah living at the same time in Jerusalem. And verse 9 of Nehemiah 8 mentions Nehemiah, the governor, the Tirshatha by name. Whenever you read around verse 50 of 1 Esdras 9, it says the governor did such and such, but it doesn't mention Nehemiah by name. So that's another curious omission in the book of 1 Esdras. Okay, concerning the date of the book. It was written around 100 BC. And probably it was written in the Hebrew language and later translated into the Greek. Josephus knew about the book, and he even knew about the Greek copy of the book. And he preferred it over our canonical Ezra. Only reason that it appears why he did prefer it is perhaps because of the Greek style of the book of 1 Esdras as compared to the Septuagint Greek translation of our canonical Hebrew Ezra would be a little better. That's another curious item about the book is Josephus knew about the Greek copy of 1 Esdras as well as the Greek copy of Ezra because he knew about the LXX. And why did he prefer Esdras over Ezra? Because although they are the same book, like I said before, there are many discrepancies between the two books where our Ezra is right and their 1 Esdras is wrong. But the Greek style, it must have been done by a different translator, in other words. The Greek style is better than the LXX Greek copy of the Hebrew Old Testament book Ezra, and perhaps it's been suggested, perhaps that's why Josephus preferred it. Like I said, it has many internal inconsistencies. It doesn't totally agree with Ezra. I can point out one thing in particular. The sacred vessels of the Lord's temple are said to be all brought back on all three of the exilic returns. You couldn't bring all of them back on each time. Each time you're returning, you can only bring part of them back. So let me give you some verses. Chapter 2 and verse 12. They're bringing all of the Lord's temple vessels back. That's one. Remember, there are three exiles, or there are three returns of the exiles, under Zerubbabel, then under Ezra, then under Nehemiah. You're supposed to know that from Old Testament introduction. So chapter 2, verse 12, chapter 4, verses 44 and 57, which would be a second return, which would be a second time all the vessels were brought back. He's not even consistent with himself, in other words. And then chapter 8 and verse 60, a third time the exiles return. Remember, if you know the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, then you know about the three returns of the exiles. Then we've got them bringing back the vessels again. Okay, the next thing I want to do is go over to chapter 3, for those of you that have it, verse 1. Now you won't have this. This is, remember, is the only section that's original. So if you don't remember anything that I've said thus far, remember what we're going to call the tale of the three guardsmen. That's what the whole book is about. The rest of it you can forget about. You've already got it in your Bible. I was just trying to help you out. But chapter 3:1 through chapter 5:6 is known as the story of the tale of the three guardsmen. It's very famous in history. A lot of sayings have come from this about the power of truth and the power of wine and the power of beautiful women. And so I'm going to read some of these verses to you. Now I've already read the first 3 verses. Talks about King Darius here. So you see, he's purporting that he's living around the middle of the 5th century BC. We just said before that really the book dates around 100 BC. Quite a bit after when he claimed that it was. So after Darius is given this great feast, and we have already read how he went into his bedchamber and he went to sleep, but he woke up again. And I said it really wasn't time for him to wake up because he's going to get up later on, and that was the right time to get up. Now all of this is not in your Bible. And by the way, there are Persian legends, Persian tales that date a lot earlier than 1 Esdras when it was written that give a very similar account about this tale of the three guardsmen. It doesn't have to be guardsmen, but it concerns an argument between three people over what's the strongest thing in the world. That's found right in Persian legends and tales, which shows that this has been incorporated into 1 Esdras right from Persian lore and legend. So what this is about, the tale of the three guardsmen, we're going to have three bodyguards of King Darius. Maybe I better give you a little history before I go into reading it. We're going to have three bodyguards of King Darius, and they're going to have a little contest among themselves. And the question that they're all trying to answer is, what is the strongest thing in the world? Now, the book doesn't tell us this, but evidently this is what we're supposed to gather from it, that whoever can answer with the best answer, then King Darius is going to reward. Now, King Darius does reward the one who gives the best answer with a lot of gifts, but we're never told until later on after the story is over that this is what Darius did. How did the three guardsmen, in other words, know that King Darius would reward them? Well, they wouldn't have known, and we wouldn't know, unless what the writer expects us to do is just assume these things. So they're going to pick three things. One of them picks wine, one of them picks kings, and one of them picks women. And then they argue over which is the strongest thing in the world. So that's what it's about. It's a very, very interesting tale. So that's why I'm going to read a large section of it here. Looks like we're going to go a little longer than I meant to, but we'll read a large section of it. So if you don't have 1 Esdras, it'll be on tape and you'll be familiar with this story. Maybe you've even heard it in other connections outside of the book of 1 Esdras, because it's a famous story. Okay, here we go, verse 4. So you can pretend like you're going to sleep, and here's your nursery rhymes. Then the three young men of the king's, it's a good story, it could put you to sleep. Then the three young men of the king's personal bodyguards said to each other, "Let each one of us name the thing which he judges the strongest. And to the one whose opinion seems wisest to King Darius, then he will give rich gifts and prizes to him. He will be clothed in purple, drink from gold vessels, sleep on a golden bed. He'll have a chariot and all of these other things and so forth. His wisdom shall give him the right to sit next to Darius and to be given the title kinsman of Darius." Then each wrote down his own statement and sealed it and put it under the king's pillow. "When the king wakes again," they said, "the writing will be given him. The king and the three chief men of Persia shall judge whose statement is wisest, and the award will be made on the merits of the written statement." So here's what one wrote. Wine is strongest. The second one wrote, the king is strongest. The third one wrote, women are strongest, but truth conquers all. When the king got up, he was presented with what they had written. He read it and summoned all the chief men of Persia and Media, the satraps, commanders, governors, chief officers. Then he took his seat, and they're all gathered together, and he says to call the young men and let them expound these statements unto us. So here's the story of the first one. Here's his speech. The first, who spoke about the strength of wine, began. "Sirs," he said, "how true it is that wine is strongest. It sends astray the wits of all who drink it. King and orphan, slave and free, rich and poor, it has the same effect on them all." You see, this is tremendous wisdom of these Persians. This is found in lores and legends of ancient Persia. Wine, you can't be a king and drink wine and it not affect you like a pauper. It'll affect you the same way. In other words, it has total dominion over mankind. It can make anyone pass out in a stupor sooner or later. Doesn't matter who you are. Very, very interesting thought. "It turns all thoughts to revelry and mirth. It brings forgetfulness of grief and debt. It makes all feel rich, cares nothing for king or satrap, and makes men always talk in millions. When they are in their cups, they forget to be friendly to friends and to relations, and are quick to draw their swords. When they have recovered from their wine, they cannot remember what they've done. Sirs, is not wine the strongest, seeing that it forces men to behave in this way, and with this he ended." So there's the argument of the first one. He says that wine can make you act like it wants to make you act. That's true. Then the second one, who spoke of the strength of the king, began his speech. "Sirs, is not man the strongest,
man who masters the earth and the sea and all that is in them. But the strongest of men is the king. He is their Lord and master, and they obey all his commands. If he bids them make war upon one another, they do it. If he dispatches them against his enemies, they march and level mountains and walls and towers. You think of the power of a king has. He just says go, and they go. And whole countries fall because of the one word spoken by a king, by a monarch. They kill and are killed. You die for your country. You die for your king. They do not disobey the king's orders. If they are victorious, they bring everything to the king, their spoils and everything else. Or take those who do not serve as soldier or go to war, but work the land. They sow and reap, and they bring their produce to the king. They compel each other to bring him their tribute. Though he is no more than one man, if he orders them to kill, then they kill. If he orders them to release, they release. He orders them to attack, they attack. To lay waste, they lay waste. To build, they build. To cut down, they cut down. To plant, they plant. So all his people and his troops obey him. Besides this, while he himself sits at table, eats and drinks, and goes to sleep, they stand in attendance round about him, and none can leave and see to his own affairs. They never disobey him in anything. Sirs, of course the king must be strongest when he commands such obedience, so he stopped speaking. You've probably heard this before. The three strongest things in the world. The third who spoke about women and truth, and this was Zerubbabel. So he's trying to get Zerubbabel into the picture is what he's trying to do. And he mentions this is the only one of the men mentioned by name. And this is the same Zerubbabel, purportedly, as the one in our Bible. And he's going to win this contest just like Daniel did. It's a lot like the book of Daniel. He's going to win a contest here and get some favors from the king bestowed upon him and his people. And he said, Sirs, it's true that the king's great, men are many and wine is strong, but who rules over all of them? Who is the sovereign power? Women, surely. The king and all his people who rule land and sea, they were born of women. They couldn't have gotten here without women, in other words. And from them they came. Women brought up the men who planted the vineyards which yielded the wine that they took to the king. You trace it back. Women are the strongest. Women. A lot of statements have been taken about women. The glory and the rank of women from this passage here. They make clothes for men. They bring honor to men. Men cannot do without women. If they have amassed gold and silver and all kinds of beautiful things, and then see a woman with a lovely face and a figure, they leave all these things to gape and stare at her with an open mouth. And all choose her in preference to gold or silver or beautiful things. You know, he's saying you can have all this gold and silver piled up around you. When you see a woman walk by, where's your eyes? It's not on that gold and silver, it's on that woman. So that shows what's strongest. And it can take the eyes of a king just like the eyes of a pauper. A man will desert his father who brought him up, and desert even his country, and become one with his wife. He forgets father, mother, and country, and stays with his wife to the end of his days. Here is the proof that women are your masters. Do you not toil and sweat, and then bring all you earn and give it to your wives? Man's out there laboring away, and he comes home, and he gives the wife the money, gives her the paycheck. She just rules him, in other words. She just stays home, puts her leg up on the couch, and relaxes. He brings all the money home. Buys her anything that she wants. She doesn't have to do anything, but just be a woman. Well, you might not have heard of this, but can't you tell some statements have been taken right out of this? Some people in ERA must have got a hold of this. Oh, it's a beautiful piece. You know, you can't deny that it's a beautiful piece of ancient literature. It's just not inspired scripture. A man will take his sword and sally forth to plunder and rob. You know, these are all these perils that men have to go through. They'll sail on the sea and the river. They'll face lions and travel in the dark. And when he's finished robbing and plundering, he'll bring the spoil back to home to his beloved. A man loves his wife more than his father or mother. For women's sakes, many men have been driven out of their minds. Many have been sold into slavery. Many have died or come to grief or ruined their lives. Do you believe me now? Certainly the king wields great authority. No country dare lift a finger against him. Yet I watched this Apamie, his favorite concubine, talking about Darius, daughter of this famous Barticus. She was sitting on the king's right. She took the diadem off his head and put it on her own and slapped his face with her left hand. The king only gazed at her open mouthed. You know, that's the typical American male. You don't dare say anything. When she laughed at him, then, he laughed. He laughed at himself. When she was cross with him, he coaxed her to make up with him. Sirs, if women do as well as this, how can their strength be denied? And then here's a little parenthetical insertion. The king and the chief men looked at one another. They know what they're hearing is true. So Zerubbabel went on, Sirs, we have seen that women are strong. The earth is vast. The sky is lofty. The sun is swift in his course, for he moves through the circle of the sky and speeds home in a single day. How great is he who does all this! But truth, too, is great and stronger than all else. The whole earth calls on truth. The sky praises her. All created things shake and tremble. With her there is no injustice. There is injustice in wine, in kings, in women, in all men, and in all their works, and so forth. There is no truth in them. They shall perish in their injustice. But truth abides and is strong forever. She lives and rules forever and ever. With her there is no favoritism or partiality. She chooses to do justice rather than what is unjust and evil. All approve her works. In her judgments there is no injustice. Hers are strength and royalty, the authority and majesty of all ages. Praise be to the God of truth. So what he ends by saying, what he wanted first of all is to show him he's going to come to his point about truth. In other words, what he says is the greatest of all things is truth. Truth is even greater than women, is what he says. But why he mentions women first is to show them that without getting in some far-off philosophical or spiritual area, namely truth, he can find something right here on the earth in their own confines that's stronger than both wine and kings, which is why he talks so long about women. But what he wants to get to is this subject about truth, that truth is the greatest because it endures forever. So he ended his speech, and all the people shouted and said, and you might want to get this down because it's a quote you'll find in, well, I've seen it in writings myself, that you'll find in different writings. Great is truth, truth is strongest. This is what the people shout. Great is truth, truth is strongest. So it's a tremendous praise of the virtues of truth. Above wine, above the strongest of men, kings, and above the strongest of all beings, women. Truth is above that. Amen. And so as the account goes throughout the rest of chapter 4, they agree that Zerubbabel, with his praise of truth and his prelude of women, has given forth the best answer of what's strongest in the world today. And as a result, he is given the right to ask whatever he desires. Now, before I go into that anymore, let's go back to our little outline. Let me see if I can make that comment I wanted to make earlier. To show you why he's done what he's done. There's a purpose for all of these books, and we'll give you that as we go along, and I'll give you the chief purpose for the book of Esdras here in a moment. But let me give you two preliminary things concerning the purpose of the book. It's not the purpose of the book, but there's no better place to put these things I want to say than under preliminary considerations for the purpose of the book of 1 Esdras. The first place, he wants to praise Zerubbabel. There's no doubt about that. That this man has a particular attachment to the Old Testament figure Zerubbabel. And he's wanting to praise him. Because remember, of the three bodyguards, only one does he give us their name, and that is Zerubbabel. He doesn't name the first one or the second one. And in the second place, it seems like he wants to set forth in perfectly correct chronological order the history of the exiles. Now he does go back pretty far in advance when he goes back to Josiah there in 2 Chronicles 35:1. He really didn't need to go back that far, but he was trying to give us a little bit of the history of the end of the kingdom of Judah so we could talk about the Babylonian captivity, so we could talk about Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years, so he could finally get to what he wanted to talk about, and that was the return of the exiles. And what he's wanted to do is give us in perfectly correct chronological order a history of the exiles. Yet I want to show you, and it's obvious this is what he's trying to do. Look how he split the book. Look on your list now that I've given you. And look how he split the book of Ezra up in so many different sections. Why not just take the book of Ezra just like it was? Because he didn't feel like the book of Ezra was in chronological order. Now he gives us this original germ of the book, the tale of the three guardsmen, from chapter 3 and verse 1 to chapter 5 and verse 6, because he wants to introduce this man Zerubbabel. And he doesn't give us Ezra chapter 2 until after he's given us this section, because Zerubbabel doesn't appear in Ezra by that name until Ezra 2 and verse 2. So that's one reason that he's gotten. In other words, look how he went from 2 Chronicles 35, 36, Ezra 1, and you have to skip down 3 more points to get to Ezra 2. It's because Ezra 2:2 mentions Zerubbabel. And he hasn't even introduced the fellow yet. He wants to give us a praise of his great ideas about truth before he can bring him into the story. And so what he does, he puts Ezra 4:7 through 24 back in its place. And this is where he's made a chronological blunder of the first order. And I want to show you why, and I doubt anyone here could correct it either. I believe I said, whenever we studied some about the book of Ezra, that it is extremely difficult to understand the book of Ezra, and I said that chapter 4 would be chief among the chapters of Ezra. To put, not only to put, but I could say just to understand what Ezra is talking about in Ezra 4. Now, if you don't believe it, you go home and try to get it figured out. Because, let me just quickly review something for you. You don't have to get all this down. But let's say that the first 4 verses, we're in Ezra 4. So you've got your Bible, Ezra 4. The first 4 verses, we're going to be talking around 536 BC. Because we're talking about the time of Cyrus. Okay, look in verse 5. Remember, he gives us 2:1 through 4:5 in another section, as set apart from 4:7 to 24. He hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus. Okay, we're talking about 536 BC. From Cyrus down to the reign of Darius. Now, he happens to be talking about Hystaspes here, king of Persia, so we're talking about 520 BC. Thus, verse 5 constitutes a 16-year period, from 536 to 520 BC. Okay, now look at verse 6. I said this is the only verse that he left out. And in the reign of Ahasuerus. Now, who's Ahasuerus in the Bible? Xerxes. And where's Xerxes found in the Bible? Esther, the book of Esther. When are we talking about there? Around 480 BC. So we've gone from 420 now to 480, or around 487 or 86 BC. And then look at the next verse, and in the days of Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes comes after Xerxes. It's not the same as Ahasuerus. And not only that, then we get down to verse 10, and we're talking about Asnapper, or he's also known as Ashurbanipal. Now we're talking about the middle of the 7th century BC. But then what throws everybody for a loop would be the last 2 verses. And this is what evidently really confused the writer of 1st Esdras. You see, Ezra's not in chronological order. Chapter 4 is certainly not in order. And Esdras, the writer of it, must have recognized that, but in trying to put it in order, then he shows the mistake of his own mind about these past Persian kings. We see that when we get down here in verse 23. Well, you see, what we have to start back with verse 7. You see, he did include, correctly, verses 7 through 24 as a section together. You see back in verse 7, we're talking about Artaxerxes. And even in verse 11, and here's the letter to Artaxerxes. So we're talking about the same king throughout that section until you get there to verse 10 that I mentioned. But then when you get to verse 23, now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai the scribe and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews and made them cease by force and power. And it's getting off the subject, but that may imply more than what Ezra said whenever it said that they made them to cease by force and power. But then look at verse 24. Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, so it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now you might not be following along, but let me help you along then. If verse 24 comes right after verse 23, and the second sentence in verse 24 says, so it ceased, and then we can read the rest of that, it means that it ceased from some time to some time. You see, that's what it means. Okay, it ceased from when? Artaxerxes. It ceased from Artaxerxes because that's what verse 23 says. It ceased from Artaxerxes to the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. What's the problem with that? Darius the Persian came long before King Artaxerxes. You'd have to have it reversed and say that it ceased from Darius to Artaxerxes, not from Artaxerxes to Darius. And so evidently what the writer of 1 Esdras thought was that Ezra was mixed up here. And you may think that too. In the last 2 verses, in telling us that King Artaxerxes came before King Darius, when he didn't. He came after him. And so that's why he grabs this chapter 4, verses 7 to 24, and sticks it in another section. He tries to get it earlier. If you go back to the 3rd point that I gave you, he's already got chapter 4. Because he's thinking that we've got a mix-up here between when Artaxerxes lived as compared to when Darius, the king of Persia, lived. And I admit, it's difficult. And we're not going to get into some of the answers because they're difficult and detailed. But Ezra chapter 4 is a very difficult passage. Some people even question the inspiration of the book because of the last 2 verses that tell us, look at verses 23 and 24 very plainly. It says that once Artaxerxes had this letter read, then he sent some people and made them stop on the temple, and they stopped from that day until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. You can't get around that fact. And yet Artaxerxes came after Darius, not before him. So what I'm talking about concerning 1 Esdras would be preliminary considerations for the purpose of the book. One of the preliminary considerations would be that he's trying to straighten out the mix-up chronologically in the book of Ezra, particularly in Ezra chapter 4, and more specifically the last 2 verses, by trying to get this section earlier in his book than we find it in the book of Ezra. It still doesn't help because if you leave verse 24 after verse 23, you've still got Darius coming after Artaxerxes. You're going to have to switch those verses around, which he doesn't, by the way. But here's the chief purpose for the book. We're going to give you, for the most part, purposes of the books to let you know why they were written. Here's the purpose. It was to secure the kindly treatment of the Jews by her present foreign rulers around 100 BC, which would be the Ptolemies. And you'll see this whenever I go back now to the tale of the 3 guardsmen and read what Zerubbabel asked from King Darius. It was to secure kindly treatment of the Jews by her present foreign rulers. Remember, she got kind treatment during the time of Ezra, whenever the king was besieged. She got kind treatment during the time of Zerubbabel. She especially got kind treatment during the time of Nehemiah, whenever Nehemiah came before the king and interceded. She even got kind treatment during the time of Esther, whenever Esther's ideas prevailed over those of Haman. And so it's just following in line with that Although we're not living during the time of the Persians now. We're living 100 BC during the times of the Ptolemies. And yet he's trying to write a book hoping that it'll get in the hands of the leaders, the Ptolemaic leaders, so that the same thing will be produced with regard to Israel as was done in Ezra, as was done in Nehemiah, as was done in the book of Esther. So I'm going back now to 1 Esdras 4:43. Then Zerubbabel said to the king has asked him, remember, he's won the contest about women and truth, and now he can have what he wants. And here's what he says: remember the vow you made on the day when you came to the throne. You promised to rebuild Jerusalem and to send back all the vessels taken from it with Cyrus set aside. Well, that's already been done hundreds of years before when this book is written. When he vowed to destroy Babylon, he also vowed to restore these vessels. And you too made a vow to build the temple which the Edomites burnt when Judea was ravaged by the Chaldeans. This is the favor that I now beg of you, my Lord King. This is the magnanimity I request, that you should perform the vow which you have made to the King of Heaven. So King Darius stands up, kisses him, writes letters to the governors who are controlling Palestine, and tells them to let him come in and give them cedar from Lebanon and build the temple at Jerusalem. Then we get down to verse 58. When the young man Zerubbabel went out, he turned his face toward Jerusalem and looked up to heaven and praised the King of Heaven and said, from thee comes victory, from thee comes wisdom. Thine is the glory, and I am thy servant. All praise to thee who hast given me wisdom. To thee I give thanks, O Lord of our fathers. And so he took letters and he set off and goes and tells his fellow Jews. They praise God that they're going to be able to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, and they have a feast for a week with music and rejoicing. So it's obvious that the purpose is to get the same, to solicit the same type of response from the current Ptolemaic leaders, as was done at these early times. Okay, I think we're going to stop there with the book then. Had a few more things, but I didn't know we'd go that long on 1 Esdras. Because that's a short book. All we're talking about would be 2 chapters, 3 and 4. But I said that it would be a little difficult because not everyone's familiar with all of these details and all of this material. If you've got the books, obviously you can be reading them in advance, but it still doesn't mean you understand the book, though. It really won't help a whole lot. Because you could have read, not known all these details that I just gave you about 1 Esdras, you could have read the whole book. I guess it'd be better to go back and read now chapters 3 and 4 and the first 6 verses of chapter 5 so you're a little more familiar with the tale of the 3 guardsmen. Although that's hard to forget. That's such a picturesque story. You don't even have to try to memorize that. You know about wine and kings and women and the truth, so it just makes sense that someone's going to put into writing what is the experience of people out in the world for ages and ages and ages. The strength of wine and kings and women, and then finally we've got truth, which is the strength above all.